so that we can hopefully get out of here this afternoon and get people back home. I would just ask this of us as a committee and of those who might testify, of our agency folks, all of us, let's be thorough, but let's expedite as best we can this afternoon so we can get through this agenda. We're a little bit behind now, but committee, just to sort of reflect, the last day and a half, we've had an opportunity, I think, to all of us learn. I've learned a great deal, and I appreciate the department for that and all of those folks who testified. And that gives us an opportunity now to move into a sort of a phase of the meeting where we can talk about if we perceive some problems out there, what are we going to do about them? You know, what are the options that we can entertain to maybe at least consider in the second meeting of the interim? And so that's really where we're at with this funding piece. We will move into some alternative vehicle discussion this afternoon, and then Taylor will help us with some statutory considerations that we may want to take up. So really what we're doing now is pointing toward that second meeting, committee. You know, where do we want to take this thing? What do we want to try to accomplish as a transportation committee? And so Director Reiner, thanks for coming back up. This follows some good testimony that we had from some company representatives, et cetera, but we're certainly interested in what you guys have to offer on this funding piece.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I did find actually the last bit of testimony helpful and really took some good notes, because it's good to get a user's perspective on some of these issues. If you would, then what we have for you should be a brief labeled practical solutions to revenue challenges. And our understanding of the tasking from you, Mr. Chairman, was that we review where we've been for the last year, 18 months in terms of this study of what are the potential revenue sources that are out there. And so I thought we'd just walk you through that as a bit of a history lesson. And then at the end, what we have is really an example of what could be considered, you know, if the committee so saw fit. And so with that,
so, Director, sorry to interrupt, but I do want to just emphasize to the committee that what we as chairman ask of the department is exactly that, and that is, you know, give us some examples, give us some thoughts about what's going on in the world, of how we might want to look at this funding piece. In no way do I want anybody to think that the department is lobbying any one direction or another. And I think I speak for you, Director, on that front.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know that's not something you can do, and we don't expect you to do that, but thank you for taking it out to the point where we've got some examples that we might at least look at. So thank you. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Mr. Co-Chairman, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we go on, because people have said some things to me, and just want to be clear, as far as I'm concerned, all options are on the table, but we have made no decisions. We aren't going one way or the other. We want to hear all the information first, and then the committee can make its own decisions. But as far as I'm concerned right now, everything is on the table. And that's one reason I'd like to see what NCSL did, mainly for the slide on what other states have done. Other ideas that we may not have thought about. So.
Well, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. And it was interesting. The co-chairman and I were down at the trucking convention last week and heard from a representative of a national group that the state of Ohio has just adopted, I think, a $250 per year charge on electric cars, for example. So we're not the only state dealing with this. We're not the only state, you know, moving forward with some issues and hopefully some alternatives, but appreciate that, Mr. Co-Chairman. And Director, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I am joined today by Mr. Jesse Kirkmeyer, who has worked hard on lots of these issues with me. I'll be the primary testifier, but he's here because he's worked a lot of the issues, and ideally welcome to the committee.
Mr. Kirchmeyer, appreciate you being here. I've seen you waiting patiently for the opportunity, and thanks for your work. So take it away, guys.
Yeah, thanks. So if we slip to slide 2 on here, really that's the agenda that we'll follow. A little bit of history on where we've been. Some misperceptions out there about our YDOT budget that we've really heard, and some of those I won't even go over because we talked them already today. And then looking at some funding options, and then the example. But if you then flip to slide 3, a little bit of history for those of you that are new to this committee in terms of where we've been in the last 12 to 18 months. And if you look at number 2 on here, in October of 2019, in front of the then Joint Transportation Committee during the interim, there was lots of talk about establishing actually a highway funding task force and doing that in the form of a bill. And that was, the committee actually decided not to do that and assigned to YDOT the task of standing up an informal working group. And so we did that early in 2020. And we had several legislators that were on that committee, and we had multiple stakeholders. Some of them are in this room, and it was actually fruitful discussions as we looked at the various ways to fund highways, and we'll see some of the results of what came out of there. What I'll tell you is that we started with that big list that NCSL showed you. It's about, I think, 52 different items on there. And we went through there line by line by line and said, would this work for us? Some of them you could do, but in those days, we understood our shortage to be about $135 million a year in terms of funding gap, because that was the number that I inherited when I came over here. And that was before the dye management study. And so as we thought about, hey, what would be a reasonable number to target for raising, we focused in on the $135 million. And so if the way of raising revenue generated $8 million or less or more, we probably, some of them didn't seem worth the time to further explore based on the return on investment. And so in the end, we settled on about 9 to study further. And then we narrowed that down to 3, brought those 3 back to the committee. And those were primarily sales tax, increase in fuel tax, and our road user charge. Also thrown in there was raising vehicle registration fees. However, that one had just been done recently and was really discarded fairly quickly as a viable choice. As we looked at those 3, the whole concept of sales tax was really deemed untenable for us as a state to increase sales tax and give it to the Department of Transportation, which really left fuel tax and a RUC. And as we looked at it, the fuel tax, and you saw what came out of the interim was, hey, the proposal to do a fuel tax. Fuel tax was a short-term solution, and the RUC became the long one. And so as we discussed that in committee, the committee actually said, hey, let's draft a RUC bill. And so that was drafted. It was heard a couple times in committee, and was actually adopted. There is some further amendments to that bill that were really never discussed and adopted, which if you're interested, we can review. But that's basically the history of where we've been sort of in this last year in terms of a summary of this alternate fundraising process. Everybody knows what happened with the fuel tax and the RUC bill this last session. And then we've added I-80, the notion of tolling I-80 back in to that mix. So that's a quick recap. if you flip over the page to page number 4, there's some misconceptions, and I'm going to really walk through these fairly quickly. Is we have had people, hey, can you just delay? And we all saw really the asphalt degradation slide, and delaying our maintenance is just in the long run increases cost. And so for us, there was, some time sensitivity to this concept of maintaining the assets we have. We have had people suggest, hey, can you just budget cut your way out of it? And budget cutting for us, if we just don't do maintenance on the road, that would cut the budget. But in the long run, again, for us, probably as a state, not really the direction that we would recommend. The question on more federal funds, and we've spent quite a bit of time today talking about federal funds. I would like to follow up actually on the question that Representative Overmiller asked about, are we walking away from federal funds? And the answer was correct, that was given, in that we are making match for all of the formula monies. But I will share with this committee that we are not applying for grants for discretionary funds that require a match, because we don't have the state funds to make the match. So and I do consider that walking away from federal money. So I would just share that is the case. We will apply for grants that are 100%, but in terms of items that require state match, really at this point, our determination is budget-wise can't afford it in terms of state money, and so we are not pursuing that federal money. There is number 4 on here. There is a perception that out-of-state drivers pay for most of the fuel tax in the state, and if we hit I-80, would pay most of that. What I'll tell you is that while out-of-state drivers pay a lot, if you look at the numbers there, the in-state traffic, so that's in-state, is 85% of total passenger vehicles and 38% of total trucks. That's the in-state. So those are numbers just to put in your mind. And so the in-state revenue is about 65% of our fuel tax. And so obviously then it's 35% would be from out of state. We don't know the precise ratios on I-80 just because it's so hard to measure people coming in and going in terms of whether they're in state or out of state. But those are some numbers that are relevant. And then you also hear this discussion of, hey, where do highway fees go? They're not all highway fees go to the roads. And we talked about that today based on constitutional rules. Most highway fees go to the roads. So, just we all know that, but not all. So unless there's any questions on that, I'm going to flip over to page number 5, because I think this is where you sort of get down into the meat and potatoes of the discussion that we had as a committee. And I'll just walk through here line by line, because it really is starts the discussion of, hey, what could potentially be a viable option for you to consider and discuss. And the first one we looked at was a sales tax on fuel. So right now, you have the fuel tax, and that's a set amount of money per gallon. What a sales tax on fuel would be is whatever, you're selling fuel for, we do a sales tax. And so we estimate, as we worked that, we said, well, if gas is $2.50 a gallon, sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher, and you have a 1% sales tax on that, it would generate, over in the right-hand column, about $8 million. So that would be a funding mechanism. So if you do 2%, it's about $16 million. If you do 3%, you do the math, about 24. So that's actually not a bad source, but it is a sales tax on fuel that would be designated then to transportation. We looked at transportation-related items tax. So a tax on batteries, car batteries, a tax on windshield wipers, and it was hard to calculate, and as we got into it, it just became the return on investment was not deemed to be there, and so you see the NA and unknown, and we did not pursue it because we didn't think it would generate enough to be relevant. We then move down to vehicle registration, and then the number to put in your mind is a $1 increase in vehicle registration for the state generates about $850,000. So if you do a $5 increase in vehicle registration, then you go over to the very right-hand column and you see it generates about $4.3 million. The column that says, YDOT 2019 revenue, that's what we earned from vehicle registration, $90 million in 2019. So that's vehicle registration and what a dollar would increase. And in this case, we said, well, what if we raise it by $5? It was about 4.3. And then we looked at vehicle sales tax, and a 1% tax on all vehicle sales would generate about $15 million. So there's that number. We looked at increasing the rental car usage tax, and a 1% increase there actually adds $39,000. So in the grand scheme of things, not a lot. And you can see what we do earn currently from that source. And then we looked at increasing some dealer license fees, and you can see what that generates, about $102,000. So those were some of the aspects we worked through as part of the list of 52. And then if you flip the page, then that's where you get down to this. Hey, what are some of the, probably in our minds, the significant additional potential revenue sources? And you start with fuel tax, and a 1%, a 1 penny increase in fuel tax generates about $4.5 million, and that's for YDOT. All of these numbers in here are for YDOT, because just remember, like on the fuel tax, there's a portion that goes to the county and a portion that goes to cities, and so this is all YDOT numbers. And then we did look at the sales tax, because certainly that would increase, that would provide the revenue that was required, and a 1% increase in sales tax is about $105 million. Then we looked at vehicle registration, and we said, hey, if we want to raise about $130 million, what would it be? So we increased the vehicle registration by $130, and that generates $112 million. So there would be another way to generate that type of revenue. We did look at a road usage charge, and as I reiterated, the interim committee last year said, hey, we want you to develop that one further. And if you charge everybody a penny for the mile that they run, it generates $104 million in the year, because as a state, we do typically run about 10.4 billion with a B miles, and the math becomes very simple. Interestingly enough, because I don't think we're going to talk details on a rock, if you ask about hey, what do you pay to run a mile right now? I don't think most people could even tell you that. But the trivia would be, well, the average American sedan gets 24.2 miles to the gallon. We know that. Fuel tax in the state is 24 cents a gallon. And so right now, the average, person in Wyoming driving a car pays 1 penny per mile for every mile that they run. And so that was really one of the reasons we picked a mile, because on the average, that's what you currently pay. Now, nobody knows it, because you pay the fuel tax at the pump and you sort of forget about it. And then I-80 tolling has come up, and you can see at the 25 cent a rate and the 2.5 for cars, that it generates about $171 million. Now, that was using that rate because that came out of the study, and none of those rates would, there's nothing cast in stone or no recommendation on here, except that was the number used in the study. So there's those significant revenue sources. And so then what I asked Jesse to do, and it gets really to the last slide on this, in this brief, and it's the example. Said, hey, Jesse, just build me a 10-year, road funding strategy example. And that's what you have here. And so let me just maybe walk you through this conceptually, because I think it's the concepts in here that really matter. So if just to orient you to the slide, I asked Jesse to use $310 million as how much money to raise a year, because we had to pick some number, and I picked that number. And it was really based off the dime management study. And then so the $427 million is because one of the key assumptions that I had Jesse make was that no funding distribution methods would change. So if you need to raise $310 million for YDOT, that means as a state, you got to raise something higher than that, because counties get some of the money and cities get some of the money. And one of the going in assumptions that we made, you could always change it, was that the distribution of revenue would stay the same. And so that means you need to raise more total than for us. But if you look, this is really from now through 2031. So this is a 10-year look. And if you just go to, there's a star underneath 2025, about halfway through the chart. And that basically says, hey, there's some new CAFE standards that take effect. And really, that's the corporate average fuel economy, which is number we should all be paying to. And that's scheduled to increase by 50% in miles per gallon. And that's something that our car makers are focusing on. And that becomes, as you scan down the next 10 years, what you know is our current collection method of fuel tax will become less effective because of the increase in CAFE standards and the advent of electric vehicles. And so that's the threat. You'll see a lots of legislative review in here, because what we tried to do was really show that in most of these instances, it's not fire and forget, or it's not, we're going to make a decision now and never look back. And we thought it was very important to show in this example that the legislative body stays in control as we go through. But let me just take you then to the very top line. Shows if somebody says, hey, we'd like to do I-80 tolling, here's the timeline for tolling in I-80. And it's across the top, and that's really, you saw those details last session, so I won't go into those today. What I will share with you, though, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, is I did talk to the Federal Highway Administration tolling authority, and I spent some time with her on the phone, making sure that we understood the program correctly and making sure that it was still a viable option. And what I'd share with you is it is. And I left there feeling more interested. The first blue box underneath 20, 22, and 24 shows, hey, here's some potential revenue sources. And I think it was Ms. First said, hey, maybe there's not one silver bullet. That was certainly the approach we took here. And so you saw a 9-cent fuel tax increase would generate $40 million. You see a $10 increase in registration fees is another $8. We could eliminate some of the diesel exemptions, because what I share with you as we went through the analysis of the RUC and looking at different rates is that 50% of diesel fuel, a large percentage of diesel fuel is not taxed. And we don't collect this. So school buses pay no sales tax on diesel, and there's many other entities that don't do that. So there's lots of revenue. We could cut back on some of those exemptions. That would raise some money. We estimated $4 million. We could increase miscellaneous fees. Mr. Co-Chairman, you took a look at that last session in terms of various fees that haven't been increased for a while. And you could have a 1% vehicle sales tax. And if you combine all those as an example, there's an amount which could potentially go to funding roads. And that's really the concept there. if you drop down to the bottom, if this body so chose to look at some sort of vehicle mileage tax, it was interesting to hear the NCSL, talk about that and how that's gaining traction and interest around the nation. Then there's certainly, I think, in my mind, pilots that could be done to start the process of converting from fuel tax to a RUC. At some point, whether it's 10 or 15 years from now, I think the fuel tax will become ineffective. And at some point, you start the process in our mind of transferring to something, and it could be any of these options that are on here. But Mr. Chairman, that's a quick review of where we've been, what we looked at, and an example of something that could be considered, pending questions or comments from you, the body.
Thank you, Director. Jesse, thanks for your work on this. Committee questions, Representative Baker, and then we'll go to Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director. Just briefly, I see you've looked at things within the agency, but on that list, there were also a number of things that were outside the agency. And I'm just kind of brainstorming here in my mind. I mean, we had House Bill 209, which dealt with cannabis. I mean, there's lottery, scratch tickets, things like that, pari-mutuel. Are any other states moving to dedicate streams of funding outside of their agency to the agency, like those lottery, things like that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, I haven't heard of people doing lotteries, but I don't think we could if we wanted. The state of Utah does allocate a certain percentage of their state sales tax to transportation. And so certainly states have very different ways of funding their transportation.
Follow up, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Referring to the last slide, Director, and the example, a 10-year example. In the first section there where it talks about potential revenue sources, it refers to a 9-cent fuel tax increase yielding 40 million. And then the second one over here is a 6-cent additional fuel tax increase yielding 66 million. So can they clarify that, please?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, that's the cumulative total. So 9 cents does 40 million. If you add 9 plus 6, 15, it would generate a total of 67.
Committee, anything else? Anything else for the Department of Transportation? Appreciate that review. Director, thank you. I'm going to wrap up testimony on this item in our agenda. I'm going to go back to offering any other testimony. Any other public testimony on this item? And Mary Beth, do we have anybody with a hand up?
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mark Larson would like to comment.
Let's bring Mark in. Glad to have him do that.
Can you hear me, Chairman?
Mr. Larson, we can. Welcome this afternoon. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Even though I do reside in Parker by Hearts in Wyoming, I just want to make sure that we don't preclude out-of-state lobbyists who do represent those people with boots on the ground in the state. Chairman, and I wanted to implore the committee to look at the fuel tax. We recognize that there's a lot of things on the table. You heard from the senator's office, you've heard from NCSL. There's so much moving right now that the petroleum marketers are convinced that we need to do something in the midterm until whether this country decides to go to a RUC, whether they decide to go to tolling, whether they decide to go to some other mechanism to try to address the depleting fuel taxes. until that time, fuel tax is still the best game in the town. For less than 1% of total cost for distribution and collection, as opposed to when we look at tolling, it's 17 to 20%. We know that there is capacity. You saw the capacity chart. We're looking at surrounding states that have also raised the fuel tax in order to help stop the bleeding. The petroleum marketers think that there's still some capacity there that we could raise the tax that would not be, I think, remember former Chairman Madden at the Revenue Committee talking about how if you do the 10 cent a gallon gas tax, less than 5% of that, like 5 cents of that, actually hit the consumer. That's true. So we're just suggesting that the committee revisit the fuel tax again. I know it's a red herring for some, but we do know that because of the system's already in place, we already know that we have the capacity to collect it and do it for less than 1%. Representative McGuire asked a question earlier about what's going on in Colorado, and I know some of the industry has concerns about that state to the south being less fuel tax, and if we raise our fuel tax, it's going to create a bigger windfall for Colorado. I'm here to tell you that there is a bill in their legislature that is passing, that is going through the process, that is making, since you know Colorado has a Tabor law, the Supreme Court in Colorado has determined that fees are not taxes. Now, I know that we all reject that, but the courts have determined, and so the CDOT in Colorado has a bill on the table where fees will act as proxies, and they will pass a tax at the refinery level, the wholesale terminal rack level, and that would be a proxy for the fuel tax. In essence, it is a fuel tax. They're also raising fees. They're doing all kinds of stuff. So it won't be long before Colorado is way above us on the fuel tax scenario. So we're not too worried about the fuel tax differentiation. One thing that tolling was mentioned earlier, and I continue, and I really appreciate the director and Mr. Kirchmeyer's efforts at RUC and tolling and all those issues. My conversations with the FMCSA and the people that are FHTA on tolling is that until we demonstrate that we have at least raised the fuel tax and done other scenarios in order to generate the revenue before we would go to tolling highways that have already been paid for by the citizens of the state, I don't believe that we are going to get an oar in the water on that one, Chairman. Because we haven't demonstrated yet that we have the will to do everything possible to raise the revenues in order to meet the needs that you saw in the dime management report. One last thing I saw on the agenda, Mr. Chairman, that they were talking about collecting for electrical vehicles. When the petroleum marketers look at the electrical vehicles, we look at the rare earth minerals, the capacity to, with 80% of China having the import market on rare earth minerals, the fact that we don't have silicone chips sufficient for current automakers. I wanted to just let the committee know of one other issue that's coming up in the co-chairman's own town of Rollins, where one of our marketers wants to convert a empty station that he owns and make it into an electric vehicle station. A lot of the utilities don't have the capacity to put in those 480 volt fast charge units. And if you don't put in a 480 volt fast charge unit, you're talking 5 to 6 hours to get a full charge or an 80% charge. So I just wanted to put that on the table for the committee when we start looking at some of the states that have just going hog wild on the electrification issue. There's a lot of issues that we would like to sit down with the committee and discuss with respect to the electrification. Right now, there's only 15 fast charge units. They're mostly in hotels put in by Tesla. And so when all the other states clamor to get rid of ICEs, internal combustion engines, We just don't see that dog hunting in the near future. We are still seeing estimates of up to 50% of all fuels in this country will be carbon-based fuels by 2050. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that the committee will consider looking at the fuel tax as a Band-Aid, if anything. I mean, the petroleum marketers realize that the need is real. And I'll stand for any questions, and thank you for your time.
Question for the petroleum marketers. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Larson, as briefly as possible, you mentioned the I-80 tolling and the restriction that Wyoming would have to demonstrate a need. Could you, in your mind, just give an illustration of what that standard would look like briefly, please?
Mr. Larson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Baker, the demonstration would be that the state has raised their taxes to the point that they could no longer raise their taxes and be viable with the surrounding states. So have they tried to take care of their own problem before they decided to go back and try to toll the highways that have already been paid for once by the consumers? When I spoke with the lady running the program, she said that would be very hard to overlook if the state did not raise its taxes at least to comparable rate with the surrounding states in order to try to take care of the roads. I hope that answered your question.
Representative, be good. Any other questions? Mr. Larson? Okay.
Thank you,
Mark, really
Committee.
appreciate it. Appreciate you always being there and look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you, Chairman.
Much appreciated. Okay, Mary Beth, anybody else with a hand up?
Mr. Chairman, no one else has their hand up.
Okay, and once more, I'm looking across the room. Doesn't look like we have anybody here. So we'll close public comment again. And on this funding piece, Mr. Co-Chairman, what are your thoughts? Should we work our way through the next two topics and then do some work at the end of the day, maybe? Or should we take up a couple of things now and get some thoughts from the committee? What do you think?
Mr. Chairman, it'd be up to you.
Well, then, by golly.
I learned from the previous speakers. As you know, I have two concepts to present to the committee.
Well, let's take them up. Let's.
Well, the one would be better after the next topic, and I guess the first one would be okay now. We can just run through them real quick.
My thought
see what
was,
the
look, we've
committees-
got a couple more categories, committee. We're going to look at alternative vehicles because I think that's just a reality we've got to stay on top of. And then we'll look at some potential statutory things that the department has come across or will probably recommend to us. At that point, then I think we could maybe take up some motions, some ideas of things that we might want to draft up to the second committee. So I tell you what, Mr. Co-Chairman, let's hold your thought.
Okay,
Let's take it to the end and let's charge right into alternative vehicles. Let's get on through the agenda and then we can take up anything that we want to ask of our staff and of our agency. So once again, I would advocate that let's charge right through this as best we can, be thorough but quick, and then we'll get to some things at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank
Director
you,
Reiner. Here we
Mr.
go.
Chairman, Director Reiner and Mr. Kirkmeyer one more time. So you should have a brief that's overview of alternate vehicle legislative needs. It's a short brief. And I'll just flip to page 2. And this is a recap of really where we're at with the automated driving systems. And which was a bill that was up last session. So where we find ourselves today is, as you're well aware, no current legislation or regulations or control of testing for automated driving systems on Wyoming roads. There is currently no requirement for anybody to advise us of what's going on the roads. We have been contacted actually by some companies who are testing such vehicles on our roads. And so, and I would share with you that the National Park Service is running a shuttle pilot in Yellowstone this summer for a level 5 autonomous vehicle test. So just as a review on this, really 3 levels that we think about: level 3, level 4, level 5. Level 3 is a little bit better than the cars we're driving now. It has a driver station, and you can basically push a button and it'll drive itself, but you have to be in there to drive. Level 4 is a little bit more complex than that. Level 5 oftentimes has no driving station at all. So that's the one where, the example that we typically use is you are one of our senior citizens. You've lost the ability to have a driver's license, but you still have mobility because you can tell that vehicle, take me to the grocery store or take me to my grandson's ball game, and it'll take you there. You can get out. And so that's the use of there. Or, as was pointed out, if you've had a little bit too much to drink at the local drinking establishment, you can walk out, you could get in that vehicle, take you home, and you cannot be arrested for a DUI because you aren't driving the vehicle. Somebody else is driving the vehicle. So there's the 3 levels. I tell you, at some point, I suspect that we may or may not, take up that issue again. My recommendation, Mr. Chairman, would be that we do that. What we are doing in the meantime is we are in the process of putting up some signs at all entrances to Wyoming that basically say if you're driving a level 5, basically autonomous vehicle, not a Tesla or level 3, but if you're involved in testing here, we want to know it. So call a number 777-4321, which is our 24-hour dispatch, or pull into the port entry, and there's actually a national database that will enter that data into, and we just want to know they're on the road for the safety of everybody involved. And that's the steps we're taking at this point to really gain situational awarenesses of what we're having. And we're doing that under department authority relative to the safety of the traveling public.
So
that's-
Director, I want to jump in just real quickly. Committee, keep this item in mind as we get to the end of the day. We can visit about this. One of the reasons that I kind of wanted our department to go back over this. Some of us sat through the previous interim. I'm looking at 2 of the senators that did, and a couple of you down this way, but a lot of us did not. And so, we received legislation on this and really didn't have the background that the previous Transportation Committee had. And so, anyway, let's keep that in mind and appreciate your recommendation that we at least consider taking a look at that again, Director. So please
Okay,
proceed.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
That's a quick update on the automated driving system issue. And then we move really to the next slide, slide 3, which talks about alternate powered vehicles and connected vehicles. And there's really no connection between the two, except that probably an electric vehicle will be connected. And so we'll just brief them here together on one page. But in terms of the electric vehicle push around this nation and other types of powers, i.e. fuel cell or hydrogen or some of the ones we may not even heard about before, they're coming at us. And we already talked about the change in the corporate average fuel economy coming in 2025. And the concept of electrifying our roads, I think, is in front of us. And my recommendation is really becomes a fairly significant task for YDOT, not to manage those stations, but to ensure that their input and to make sure that we work with funding sources and set the conditions for industry to start putting in these electric vehicle charging stations. There are Tesla stations in the state, in this state. In fact, the motel we were staying at, the Hilton Garden Inn, had 3 of them, 4 Tesla, right out there by the road. And I really, our recommendation is that we start looking at, hey, how do we collect usage fees? 1, on the charging, 2, eventually probably on the miles driven, but really initially probably on the charging. we do think that there's probably some legislation required to capture a mileage if we go that way, but maybe actually to put, to even charge some of the fees that would be at the charging station. I do think as we took a cursory look at this, that there's some public service commission input that may be relevant because their rates change during the day based on demand. And I'm not smart enough to tell you today what the solution would be, but I do think that that's an aspect to explore as we move down this road. And
So Director, when you go that direction, having spent the last 2 years on corporations in the middle of all of that public service stuff, are you thinking in the back of your mind that if I plug in at 2 o'clock in the morning, that maybe we have an alternative charge versus peak hours?
Mr. Chairman, I think there has to be a discussion of how that works. And potentially it would be maybe, I know they really make no money. And so it's part of how they're funded and how they calculate their rates. So I think there's the rate discussion with the PSC is relative to what's charged at the charging station.
So the Transportation Committee can't just set that and say that we reached out, or no, I'm kidding. No,
Well, Mr.
I
Chairman,
hadn't thought about the Public Service Commission,
So
okay. Well,
So there's that. So we don't have a readily available funding source. There is $1 million-ish right now sitting with the Department of Environmental Quality in Wyoming that was part of the VW settlement fund that is earmarked for electric vehicle charging stations. But in terms of the number of stations that would have to go in across the state and the cost of those stations, I would consider that seed money and we'll fund not many. But hey, it's better than nothing. And so that's there. So
Director, just to pick up on that piece, I think most of us up here, all of us up here are free enterprise people. But realistically, this is an expensive transformation of a station. You talked about the co-chairman's neighborhood and an empty service station. You've got to get a hold of Rocky Mountain Power or whatever your power source is, and they've got to completely metamorphosize that facility, don't they? And that's not cheap.
Mr. Chairman, you are correct, not cheap. To some extent, I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg here, and I think we really have to think through the role of government. But the issue is for capitalism and the free market to put in a station, there has to be demand. Otherwise, you can't make a profit and you can't stay in business. But there can't be a demand until there's a station. And so I think the question for us to explore is there other pockets of money, like from the federal government, that are available to kickstart the charging stations and to really get that going. And Mr. Chairman, I just to walk our way through that, we don't have the answers today. Where we're at is we do have a working group that I've actually tasked Mr. Kirkmeyer to head up. And we're at the very beginning stages of that, but we'll talk with.
I'm going to have you hold that thought for just a
Okay.
moment, Director, and thank you, Jesse, for your willingness to work that. The co-chairman has a question or a thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, you said we have settlement money sitting with DEQ. I think you said $1 million in that. Now, is that state, in effect, state money that we have to spend on electric vehicle charging stations or for the infrastructure for them? Or what are the stipulations on that money? I'm just curious because this is the first I've heard of that one.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, so I've not read all the details, and if Mr. Kirkmeyer has, he can help me out here. My understanding is we actually received more than $1 million from VW as part of that settlement fund, but about $1 million of that is earmarked for the state to be able to use to help implement, electric vehicle serving stations. Now, my understanding is, and again, my understanding is that DEQ is in the process of establishing a program where you can apply for part of that money in a match type scenario. So the state would give you part of that money, you put in some of your own to stand up in a vehicle charging station. Jesse, can you help expand on that, please?
Yes, sir. I think that's basically correct. The portion set aside, the $1 million is going to be used for matching. Unfortunately, $1 million is probably only going to buy 2 complete stations. So they're trying to make those dollars go as far as possible. And again, it depends upon how big the DC fast chargers you put into each station and how many portals that you put in. And that, of course, increases the cost of each station. I think they're looking at 2 portal and possibly 4 portal stations on the lower side of that DC fast charging capability, which means it would take folks longer to charge their vehicles. Of course, there's advantages to a lower power draw, but as you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, the IOU, the investor-owned utilities, do have rates, peak rates, and sometimes one person plugging their car in will peak that rate. And that means whoever owns that charging station is going to pay that peak rate, possibly based upon their contract the entire month. And then it may never get used again for days or weeks before the next EV comes up. So we do have some challenges that we have to address.
So it sounds like the Department of Environmental Quality is in the grant business now with regard to this fund. And the reason I ask it that way is I'm curious if the Wyoming Business Alliance was involved or consulted with, and it just seems to me like that would be a natural marriage. But you had something else, Mr. Co-Chairman.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman, and that is DEQ the correct agency to be doing that? I mean, this isn't things they normally do. I know the money might reside with them, but it is a better match for Department of Transportation or the Business Council or someone else. And I'm just asking an opinion.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, that's what we inherited. Our intent is to work with DEQ, the Wyoming Energy Authority, the Business Alliance, and others to really format a way ahead. My understanding is, and I don't know who made the decision for it to go there, but I think the policy of the interagency can be applied. And I probably don't really care where the money sits, as long as the policy and how you get to it makes sense.
Director, I think that's a good point. I'm looking down at the chairman of Minerals and Economic Development, and he'd be more of an expert than me on the Business Alliance and Business Council and the work they do. But ultimately, I think you're right. I think our committee would like to see us at least begin to get some things set up. But Senator, any thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, I'm really surprised at this discussion. In our minerals meetings, we've talked about where these charging stations are and who's putting them in and everything. Now, of course, Tesla put theirs in 5 years ago, and they figured out a route to get to South Dakota and to Yellowstone Park, and they put those in. But we've been told that those other charging stations are put in. Now, I don't know if they're the high-powered ones. I've heard 3 to 6 hours to charge. So they're obviously not the high-powered ones, but we've been shown where the critical stations are across Wyoming. And of course, that's I-80 is where they say they have it covered. So I don't know, maybe we're talking a whole different group of charging stations.
I appreciate that, Senator Anderson. And I think just communication and coordination is going to be the key going forward. And Director, you're probably well aware of that, both of you gentlemen, but anything specific, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director. My question revolves around a survey that YDOT's doing and did recently online about the electronic vehicles and the charging stations. I shared that survey online and actually got a lot of negative feedback. So I think, like you're saying, Mr. Chairman, I think one of the biggest hurdles in this discussion is overcoming public sentiment about electric vehicles as a whole. So I think, one is, are you familiar with the survey? And two, when can the committee maybe expect to see some of the comments or the feedback from the survey?
That's a great question. And gentlemen, that's exactly where I was going to go. So appreciate that, Representative. As we look at maybe a second meeting this interim, is that too soon? Is that something that we can go to work on and have a report back? Or
Mr. Chairman, we would be fully prepared to, I think, give you a fairly in-depth brief of where we're at, where we think we're at with the electronic vehicle process. Senator Anderson, maybe to your comment, I wouldn't mind hearing who they is, and I can get with you afterwards. I'm hoping it's part of the people we'll partner with, because my sense as I started looking at this as the director of YDOT was that there was not one synchronizing element in our state really taking a look at this. And it just seems like it's a Department of Transportation issue to me in the end, because it's on our horizontal transportation assets. And so I think we got a lot of partners. So I'm probably in the interest of, okay, let's have a huddle and let's have a definitive, where are we at and where are we going and how, what's our thought on how to get there. And part of that, I think, is to you as the Transportation Committee is what are the potential legislative actions that we would see and recommend. And I know there's more that will come out of there.
sure.
So that would be my proposed way ahead, Mr. Chairman. And I think we've got some meetings lined up, and there has been some activity across the state. So we aren't completely
Right.
broke, but I think we just need all of us as the transportation leaders need to understand where we're at and where we're going.
Oh, I think that's an excellent thought. I suspect by the end of the day, we're going to suggest that maybe we'd like to hear more. And I'm looking at the co-chairman, but I'm thinking that second meeting has this topic written all over it. Our desire is not to step in front of the chairman and his committee, but to, as you say, synchronize, make sure that that we're all on the same page and moving forward. And if it takes some kind of legislation, I wouldn't have any problem going in front of that committee or vice versa, whatever that would take. Because I know that committee is going to want to be aware of business and economic development, and this world is that. So, committee, any other questions? Otherwise, Director, I'd have you proceed through any other comments you'd have on this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask Mr. Kirkmeyer if he has any knowledge of the survey, perhaps to respond to Representative Baker, because I did not respond to it.
Mr. Kirkmeyer, go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, Representative Baker, I am familiar with the survey. However, we're trying to take a more holistic and I agreed there's some negative aspects of EVs, specifically with the residents of the state, but we're really kind of directed to take a more holistic look. I think there's a number of things working. I don't know if you want to say in our favor or against us. So one is to encourage the EV driver from out of state to continue to come to the state for tourism. And so that is part of it. The second is, and it remains to be seen the impact it will have, but as these OEMs, these large OEMs start producing more vehicles that are EV based, you probably are aware that today Ford is releasing the Lightning, which is the F-150 version of the EV, could possibly win some non-EV folks over to the EV side of the argument. And GM has already come out pretty strongly and said by 2030, they're only going to build EVs. So we're not trying to just look at what folks think about it now, but how will this technology be expected to operate and how will people adapt to it in the future? And since this is quite an expensive endeavor, we have to lay the foundation now if we want to make sure that we're going to be able to support the population in the future.
I'm kind of grinning. Thank you, Mr. Kirkmeyer. Very excellent thoughts. And I just had this vision of pulling up to my next branding with an electric F-150. Just wondering what the reaction would be. Anyway, yeah, I think the biggest thing in our minds, many of us, is we still have visitors, millions of them that want to come to Wyoming. And like it or not, by the year 2030, 30% of all the cars manufactured and purchased will be electric vehicles. That's an article I read not long ago. So just swallow that for a minute. About another third of the cars will be hybrid, and then the rest of them will be combustion engine. But thank you for those thoughts. Anything else on this topic?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just finish with a couple comments on connected vehicles. And I just really consider this an update to you as the Transportation Committee. And as you know, we've been involved in this connected vehicle test for the last about 3 or 4 years. One of 3 states involved in the test. Phenomenal results. And what it used was called a dedicated short range radio, DSRC for short. And the concept is vehicle to vehicle communication, so that if Representative McGuire, has the unfortunate, accident on an icy road, and then, Representative Chairman Burkhart is behind him and then runs into him, and, you get the domino effect. And we've had those over time of these huge pileups, specifically on I-80. And when you do the forensics on those accidents, it's not instantaneous. It's 20 to 30 minutes of people running into each other. And the concept of the connected vehicle is really simple. There's a radio that knows whether I'm healthy or not in terms of a vehicle. And so if Representative McGuire's in the first rig and he's crashed on the road, it sends out a message, and Chairman Burkhart won't hit him, and everybody else behind get the message, pull over and stop, accident ahead. And we just, as we started down that road, and our focus was on heavy trucks, we saw that as the next seatbelt in terms of saving lives on our roads. So we still kill between 30 and 35,000 people in this nation on the roads every year. And many of it is these car-to-car collisions that could be stopped if the cars were intelligent and talking to each other. And we just thought it was important to pursue that. And what I would update you on is, while the tests were going very well with great results, being briefed at the national level, and the FCC simultaneously, so that's the Federal Communications Commission, decided to pull over 50% of the spectrum that short range radio was operating on. And they gave it to the non-regulated wireless providers. So the advantage of that is, now if your kids are bored on the road, they can actually tune into a movie on your in-car, TV set and watch a show. That's where that spectrum went to. But the effect has been that there's really not enough space now in that spectrum to facilitate DSRC. So the FCC issued their final ruling here about 3 weeks ago. We fought it hard. I'll just share with you that, and I, as really the lead state on this trucks, we were very vocal, and your director was very vocal. But in the end, the decision was made. So we're in the process now of saying, Roger, okay, that's the decision. We're looking for other options. We right now, with some of our trucking partners in the state of Wyoming, we've input a Sirius radio into their cab. And that's helping, but that provides real-time onboard situational awareness of road conditions, but it's not vehicle to vehicle. I don't know yet what we're going to do with vehicle to vehicle. I don't know. We got to figure it out, because it's an issue of, what spectrum and how will you communicate it with. It's one of those real live examples of, those of you that are ham radio operators or do anything with spectrum, is there's only so much of it, and it's highly regulated and very, very valuable in terms of dollars. So that's where we're at there. Mr. Chairman, I wish I could suggest some legislation to you that would fix that, but I can't because it's a federal issue. And I'm just deeply disappointed about the potential life-saving capabilities that we think we have been seriously degraded over time. So there's a quick update on connected vehicles. Now, I'll tell you, as we get more and more EVs, I suspect over time they'll become CV, whenever we adopt that. And it could be that we got to wait until, the 5G cell phone network is mature enough. But here's the interesting thing about 5G. That thing is really short in terms of the ability to push data and to project. And so when you start looking at 5G, because there's a bunch of people pushing 5G for this technology, is you really have to have a repeater about every mile. So think about I-80. So every mile, you're going to have some sort of electronic device to assist with roadside comms. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me, but we'll see where that goes, and we'll keep working it. But Mr. Chairman, that's an update on connected vehicles that I just share with you because you're the transportation committee. Mr. Chairman, that's it on this, pending any questions you might have.
Appreciate it, Director. Thank you, committee. Any final questions on this front? And hopefully, Director, you and your folks can stick around for any discussion coming up.
Mr. Chairman, we're here.
Okay, good deal. I think we're going to offer any public comment real quickly. Do we have anybody online?
Mr. Chairman, we have Dave Picard with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation and Anne Marie Lewis
All right,
with Auto Innovators.
terrific. Let's bring Dave on board, and glad to hear from him.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is
Mr.
Dave
Pickard,
Pickard.
welcome.
Oh, thank you. I apologize that I'm not there in person, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to tee up my colleague Anne Marie Lewis with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. The Alliance, just in most of the committee, listened to Josh Fisher during the legislative session. Josh is testifying in the state of Illinois today and was unable to join us. So we have Anne Marie, but just as a quick background, remember that the Alliance represents 99% of the car and light truck manufacturers or vehicles sold in the United States. We cover quite a range of OEM and other supply chain members, through the parts arena, et cetera. I did provide the co-chairs and the committee with 2 letters on the 2 topics that just were discussed by the director and Mr. Kirkmeyer. We really appreciate the work that has gone into the working group over the course of 2020, ultimately resulting in Senate File 7 being before you as a legislature. We did in that letter provide what our concerns were at the end of the legislative process regarding autonomous vehicles, and any specific questions that you might have, I'll go ahead and defer to Anne Marie. And then the other letter, and we're happy to share these with the department and others in the room, and we'll make sure that LSO has a copy of them for the record as well. The other discussion is on the electrical vehicle fees, and we're certainly going to be at the table as those discussions proceed throughout this interim process, and we're happy to do that. So with that, Mr. Chairman and members, if it's okay with you and you don't have any questions for me, I'm going to turn it over to Anne Marie Lewis.
Mr. Chairman.
We do have a quick question, Mr. Pickard. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Pickard, I did receive those letters of yours last night. I would suggest if you're going to send letters, send them 2 or 3 days before the meeting so we can read them before the meeting. it was late last night when I got back from the airport and I did not read those letters. So if you can get them to us a little sooner, it would really help me.
Mr. Chairman, we certainly will. We do apologize for the lateness of it. We're with Josh, as you recognize, the letters were signed by Josh, and he's been testifying in Illinois the last couple of days. So we'll take that. I hear you loud and clear, and we'll make sure that it's more timely in the future.
Mr. Pricker, we understand, and I think we'll be ongoing with some of these discussions and policy concerns. So I know that we'll all get a chance to get a look at it. I too didn't get a chance to read that, but please, by all means, let's hear from your colleague and look forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Ms. Lewis, we can, if you, for just the formality, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Anne Marie Lewis, and I'm the Senior Director of Technology, Mobility, and Policy at the Alliance of Automotive Innovation. So thank you all for providing us the opportunity to weigh in on this important topic today. As Dave mentioned, we became engaged in the YDOT stakeholder group almost a year ago when we learned that there was a desire to pass a comprehensive AV deployment bill. Just to be clear, it's not our position that states need to pass laws in order to be a welcoming environment for AV testing or deployment. However, with the legislation clearly moving, it was certainly important for us to be at the table, and we really appreciated the collaborative process that was taken by YDOT. That being said, we were unable to resolve certain issues, and as amended in the House, there are several provisions that would create barriers to deploying automated vehicles in Wyoming. So therefore, we're unable to support the bill today. And I'll just quickly outline 4 areas that are problematic for our members. The first is an amendment from insurance stakeholders, which would require liability insurance in the amount of $5 million before AV deployment. So we are completely fine with a $5 million threshold for AV testing, but to have this requirement for vehicles that could be owned by individuals represents a huge barrier to their deployment. We think that when it comes to deployment, AVs should have parity with conventional vehicles on insurance requirements. And the second issue is regarding the testing provisions in the bill, which would create a process for YDOT to issue temporary operating permits. We had recommended that if Wyoming is going to set up a testing program, that this be structured as a notification approach, like other states have done. Otherwise, the Wyoming testing program will contribute to a patchwork of testing regimes that we're starting to see crop up across the country with different requirements in each state, and ends up really deterring companies from testing in those states. And the third issue that prevents our support is the amendment that was supported by insurance stakeholders to require that all AVs be equipped with what they call an ADS data logger. This requirement would be at odds with existing federal law for vehicle event data recorders, which is essentially the black box that's currently on vehicles and records information about a crash. Automakers have actually taken it on themselves to update the existing standard for event data recorders so that it includes AV specific data elements. But the requirements that the insurance industry would like to see is not congruent with the industry standards. So there's a conflict there. And the fourth issue we wanted to raise is in section 105C of the bill, which would make a blanket requirement regarding the types of vehicle information that would need to be accessible to law enforcement following a crash. We're certainly not opposed to providing crash information similar to what's done for conventional vehicles today. And for this reason, we think this section should be eliminated to ensure parity with conventional vehicles. So for this reason, the approach taken in the bill as amended in the House is unfortunately not one we can support, and we respectfully urge the committee not to pursue similar legislation. If the That being said, if the committee does, of course, we would love to be a resource and hope that our concerns could be considered and addressed going forward. I also wanted to add that our association is currently developing a state AV scorecard. And currently, Wyoming is at the top of that list. The reason why is because currently Wyoming does not have an AV law on the books that presents any sort of barrier for testing or deployment, like so many other states do. So with that said, we would just encourage the committee to, again, not pursue this legislation and support a more flexible approach that can really support AV testing and deployment in the state. Thank you.
Bless you. Ms. Lewis, thank you. Appreciate you being here this afternoon. Committee, questions of the folks who represent alternative and autonomous vehicles? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Lewis, if we have legislation on this, similar to, say, House Bill 7, what does Wyoming get out of it? What's the benefit to Wyoming? Say, opposed to a bill that prohibits testing of automated vehicles?
Well, if there's
Senate file. Sorry, it was a Senate file. The senators corrected me. Please, if you can answer that or would.
Yeah, Representative. Certainly. I mean, of course, we would love to, if there is going to be a bill, of course, we'd love to see one that encourages AV testing and deployment. And the reason why is because of all the benefits that that will come from AVs in the long term. I think someone mentioned earlier statistics on fatalities a year that we see on our public roads. 94% of those, according to the US DOT, are caused by human error. And so we believe, and our members believe, by taking the human out of the loop and automating things so that we don't have accidents caused by drunk driving, drowsy driving, distracted driving, that we can really improve safety on the roadways. So that is the primary benefit that we see of AVs, and we want to make sure we can bring that to all the states in our country.
Go ahead.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. So, Ms. Lewis, I think what you're talking about, though, are Class 8 vehicles that are completely autonomous. And that's many years down the road. What does it bring Wyoming today to allow them rather than to forbid them?
Well,
Ms.
I would
Lewis?
argue, oh, thank you, Representative. I would argue that there are safety benefits that could come from lower levels of automation as well. Even, what they call level 3 conditional automation, and level 4, which can be operated on specific geographic locations like highways, but maybe not in urban areas. There's certainly, benefits that we would see similar to what benefits we see from existing automated features on vehicles, like adaptive cruise control or lane keeping assist, things that provide kind of a second check on the driver to help keep them in their lanes and avoiding collisions. Things like automatic emergency braking is a really good example. So those are here today. So we're talking about incremental improvements in the near term and then long term fully automation.
Okay, Co-Chairman, good. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a quick question about the future. I keep seeing little teasers from Tesla about their next reveal. Do you have any idea as to what that might entail?
So, Ms. Lewis, what can you tell us about Tesla coming up?
Well, Representative, I appreciate the question. I have to say, unfortunately, Tesla is the only automaker we do not represent, so I cannot speak to their technology.
Any other questions? I actually have a question, Ms. Lewis. I kind of approached this bill in the last session as a framework that I was told and kind of believed that it was important for our state to at least get a framework in place. Was I mistaken in that? And if not, what is the importance again, so that we understand why we would need such a framework for these kinds of vehicles in our state.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that that legislation that creates a framework is not necessary in order to, as a prerequisite to have AV testing and deployment in a state. We have seen other states take an approach of maybe the DOT puts out a policy document, not necessarily a new regulation, but a document saying kind of we're open for business. We're excited about AVs, and please, if you test in our state, please contact our this number. Please let us know what you're doing, but we want you to come and participate in our state. And I think from our members' perspective, that is really the best way to, it's a very flexible framework. You can still call it a framework, but it's not so onerous that there's, reporting requirements or the insurance bar that I mentioned that will certainly prohibit deployed vehicles and things like that. Especially as the top technology is so new and still in the development stage. A simpler, more flexible, yet transparent approach is one we would advocate for.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Co-Chairman, and then I'll go to Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Lewis, would your organization be interested in something similar to Senate File 7 if it was a pilot project bill?
Ms. Lewis, go ahead.
I am not sure right now, but we can get back to you on that.
Okay, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Lewis, the question that I have is, as I read the trade journals that deal with trucking, and I'm going to talk about Class 8s. So right now, the information that I've gleaned is that the technology is primarily coming from China. A lot of these Chinese companies have an American subsidiary, and the initial deployment will be running Class 8s from a terminal to terminal. So for example, Salt Lake to maybe Cheyenne, and then from Cheyenne to Council Bluffs or something like that. And what I'm reading is that primarily they're building, or they're going to, they're looking towards newer technology Class 8s that run a hybrid type fuel. So they will fuel them up at one terminal and send them to the next terminal. So that truck's not going to stop anywhere to purchase diesel fuel along the way. Obviously, they're not going to stop and buy a meal or anything like that. If they're running a hybrid fuel and they're not paying fuel tax, going back to the good co-chairman's initial question, in that scenario, what is the benefit to the state of Wyoming? Thank you.
Ms. Lewis?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I have to say, unfortunately, I am not going to be able to answer those questions. We do not represent heavy duty vehicles. And so I'm sorry, I can't answer the question.
Okay, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lewis, are you familiar with the Smart Columbus and the, their innovation highway that they have?
A little bit.
Okay, so I'm thinking in the Wyoming context, in terms of developing, the legislative piece, whether it's a framework, or a pilot, but would you believe your members may be interested in providing some input on something like that for some area of Wyoming where you have, basically this is a section of highway that goes from Columbus to another smaller town, and they have all the signage and everything related to electric and so on for new kinds of technology related to vehicles and so on. And it's basically a real world testing highway.
Yeah,
What's your view on that?
I think that our members would like that. I think that it's a little complicated. I know you were just briefed on the FCC recent decision to reallocate connected vehicle spectrum away from DSRC. Typically, when we see these smart corridors, the connected vehicle aspect is a big part of that. And so I think it'll kind of remains to be seen a little bit what winds up happening with the spectrum. That being said, I think you have a great point about creating a corridor where signage could be optimized and lane markings could be make sure that they're well maintained and visible by the machine vision systems on the vehicle, and that can be a place where vehicles can be tested. I think that is something worth considering further.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lewis. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, back to that question of us getting the fuel taxes. I don't think it matters what the fuel is. We still get the IFTA taxes, whether it's hydrogen or propane or whatever this blend is. They're still paying by the mile to run across Wyoming. In another meeting, I heard that we're already testing trucks and autonomous trucks across Wyoming, and the trailer and the tractor have Nova written on them. And in fact, on I-80, twice I've seen Nova trucks, and the inside windshield and side curtains are all blacked out. They said that there's still an operator operating those trucks. I mean, still in there, an engineer in there working it, but supposedly it was autonomous. So I think we're already testing that. I don't know what kind of laws we need to protect ourselves, but I think we're into testing now. Thank you.
So, Ms. Lewis, do we have unidentified driving objects on I-80 already?
Question. Well, again, I don't represent the heavy duty trucking side, so I can't say about Nova. But I know that from our members' perspective, it's very important for them before they test anywhere that they reach out to local law enforcement, local policymakers, to notify them of the testing. I have never heard an example when that was not the case, but of course, I've been wrong before. So, and to the point about a engineer or test driver being in the vehicle, that is true for our members as well, that there is always one or most often two test drivers in the vehicle while they're testing the vehicle.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, committee? Okay, thank you, Ms. Lewis, for being here this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you
Mr.
all.
Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Mary Beth, you're not interrupting. Do we have somebody who's next?
We do. Mr. Mark Larson would like to comment.
Okay, let's bring Mark back in, by golly. We were missing Mark.
Thank you, Mr.
know,
Chairman.
and-
Thank you for the indulgence of letting me talk to you twice.
Absolutely,
now?
Mr. Larson. We were
Okay.
missing you, so.
I just wanted to follow up, Chairman, with the committee on the electric vehicle and the excellent job that the director and Jesse did in the presentation. Petroleum marketers, our national association is called the Petroleum Marketers Association of America. We changed our name. We're now the Energy Marketers Association. And that just demonstrates that we want to be the purveyors of all fuels that come out to the consumers. You'll recall, Mr. Chairman, that not too long ago, there was a big push for EV or CNG. A lot of our marketers went out and put close to $1,500,000 into CNG infrastructure, and unfortunately, it just has not panned out. So please pardon if we're a little reluctant when we start looking at EVs and some of the others and some of the grandiose goals that we've seen out there. I wanted to follow up on previous discussion and let you know there is technology, and I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, Chairman, when you talked about the cost of utility infrastructure and getting these facilities ready for a big 480 volt level 3 charger that runs about $45,000 and an additional about $20,000 for installation. There is new technology, I'm happy to report, on battery assisted fast charging that works off of a 220 volt or less. But the cost in that right now is about $165,000. No, there's no installation costs. Virtual, just get the hookup for the 220, and you have your telecommunications, and you're ready to go. So it's really changing quickly. I wanted to address the grant discussion that was earlier. And I believe DEQ is in the position for the grant because I think mostly they're addressing the Volkswagen settlement. And so most of the grants are relative to air quality. So that's probably why they've been made the focus of that, but that's neither here nor there to us. A lot of states are doing some pretty decent incentives. The state to the south has got an incentive that private industry is coming up with some matching grants. So some of the people are able to put fast chargers in at relatively no cost to them. One thing that we are worried about is in many states, you're seeing legislation come forward where utilities are wanting to use ratepayer monies in order to forward the mission of electric vehicles. We wholesalely reject that. We hope the committee will keep a sharp eye out for that coming forward. We don't believe that utilities using ratepayer money should be competing with private industry who really want to have skin in the game. The last thing I want to address, Mr. Chairman, is just some of the logistics that we're facing in the convenience store industry in moving forward and having EV technology. Fueling an ICE, internal combustion engine, as you all know, takes 3 to 5 minutes. Fueling an EV up to an 80% charge takes in most of the equipment up to 30 minutes. The new equipment, 20 minutes for an 80% charge at $165,000. My point is that most of the convenience stores that you know have limited space for parking. We already have significant amount of parking spaces right in front of the store that are dedicated to American Disabilities Act. We just want you to be cognizant that when we start talking about the cost of moving forward for a fast charging unit and dedicating spaces for a customer who's going to be there 30 minutes is something we're going to have to slice and dice in order to come up with a good policy. The one thing that we are concerned about is in that same thing you talked about earlier, Chairman, where utilities are going to have skin in the game, and if they even have the capability in their transmissions in those areas. So I just wanted to kind of give you a lay of the land. We're all in. If the customers want to come to our stations and buy electricity, and we have a gasoline gallon equivalent for kilowatt hours that we can help the highway situation, we're all in. We're good on hydrogen, even though we're not seeing hydrogen, any hydrogen stations. And wow, you talk about some logistical issues at retail on those. And I'll look forward to those discussions in the future. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me speak twice.
You're welcome, Mr. Larson. Thank you. And the smile on my face was just hearing you say you're all in. There were pieces of that didn't sound like you were all in, but that's okay. We'll take that under advisement. Good cautions. Appreciate all your thoughts. Committee, anything for Mr. Larson? Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you, committee.
We'll talk to you soon. Okay, we've lost our associate over there, Mary Beth. So Heather, can you look on and see if we've got additional folks who want to testify on
Yes, Your
alternative
Honor.
vehicles in this category? Don't want to miss anybody. And I'm looking at the room once again to make sure that do we have anybody who wants to step forward in the room? Doesn't look like it.
Mr. Chairman, there is nobody else in the waiting room.
Okay, I'm going to
Or
close
waiting to
public
testify, I mean.
testimony on that category. Committee, we're going to keep charging. You notice the play on words. And we're going to bring YDOT back up. And Taylor, come on down. Thanks for your patience today. Good to see you. And Director, Good to see you again. Are you exiting? Or coming back?
Oh, Mr.
You're
Chairman,
coming
I'm
back.
here. I
Okay,
grabbed
good.
my other,
Taylor, I thought he was leaving you up here all by yourself.
but Mr. Rossetti's got it.
Okay.
Um,
Statutory update, thoughts, et cetera. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Taylor Rossetti, Support Services at YDOT. Before you, I've got 2 pages here before you. It's a single statutory update. There was an awful lot of heavy lifting by you guys last year, so I tried to take it a little easy on you. Also, in conversation with Ms. Jarvis, there's an issue from a bill from last session that I'd also like to discuss if you'd indulge me at the end of this, but I'll try to go through this. If you guys have any questions or need anything, absolutely let me know. So before you folks is a single statutory update, and what it centers around is one of the federal requirements for a disqualification of a commercial driver's license. If a person is convicted of a certain offense, the offense that we're specifically talking about here is a severe form of human trafficking while utilizing a commercial motor vehicle. So this is an offense where this penalty exists specifically for the utilization of the vehicle in the commission of the crime. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we move through. By way of reference, there is some support information that I've provided to LSO that you guys should get as well in order to look through this. The requirement itself is in 49 CFR 383.51. And actually it then has a definition that it puts you to US code. And as I look through US code and that definition of severe human trafficking, it seemed to really mirror the statutes that Wyoming already has in Title 6, Chapter 2, Article 7, which is our human trafficking statutes. So if you see what I've tried to do here on page 2 of the slideshow is a proposed recommendation to the statute where we would modify a section that already exists as it relates to commercial motor vehicles utilization in certain felonies. The felony that we currently have in our statute, and there is a typo there on page 2, I apologize. It is actually in 317305E. The current one involves the manufacture, distribution, or dispensing of a controlled substance or possession with intent to manufacture, distribute, or dispense a controlled substance. So that since the penalties were similar, the thought as I was working through this was to modify this section as indicated in the red underlined portion and just say that basically a person shall be disqualified for life if they use a commercial motor vehicle in the commission of a felony. And then underneath that outline the 2 conditions under which I believe that would exist. It seemed like a simple way to incorporate this. And I could certainly, if the committee is interested in moving this thing forward, I could work other solutions, but this seemed like the easiest way to move this thing forward. With that, I certainly stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Rossetti, thank you. So this really came about with your thought that we did not cover this circumstance. And upon further review, it looks like you discovered that in 2019, we did update that a little bit. And so then you're making the recommendation that we see on page 2 of the slide presentation. Do I understand that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for the confusion there. So the human trafficking disqualification that was added on September 23rd of 2019 was actually the requirement in the federal code. So this was a new federal requirement in 2019. So we did not have this addressed anywhere in our statutes. And this is the attempt to just get that there to provide clarification to our constituents.
Thank you for clarifying that. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What is the penalty for not being compliant after the 3-year deadline?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, currently in conversations with Federal Motor Carrier, there's not a specific penalty assigned to this. In all reality, in order to remain compliant and have those licenses issued, we would, as the administrators of the driver's licenses, likely have to impose this lifetime ban on a commercial driver, regardless of it being in statute. It's a federal requirement to be compliant with the law. The purpose of trying to put it here in statute is really just to clarify and so that folks in Wyoming understand that this is an actual requirement.
Good, Representative. So Heather, let me just ask, you handed us quite a bit of information here. Can you clarify what you just gave to the committee?
Mr. Chairman, that is from Mr. Rossetti. And
And
so he can clarify. I would be happy to clarify, but I think he would be better at it.
no problem. I'm going to go to Mr. Rossetti and I'm going to ask him the same thing. So Mr. Rossetti, can you help me understand what you just gave to me? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. So
Before you start, Mr. Rossetti, could I have a
Senator
question?
Anderson, absolutely.
The penalty for this is to lose your CDL for life, I believe it says. Is that another one of those federal requirements? I had a friend that had 3 DUIs and was supposed to wait 10 years and he could get his CDL back. But then the feds said he couldn't because it was a lifetime.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, Chairman Landon, Senator Anderson. Yeah, and that is actually, this is a lifetime ban, and this particular ban, being convicted of a felony while using a commercial motor vehicle in that act, is a true lifetime ban. There is no opportunity for reinstatement. So a commission of that felony with a commercial vehicle is a lifetime ban for a CDL. It's a true lifetime ban, no opportunity to reapply or anything.
Wow.
So, and that is a federal requirement, and that does take us to the document that you just received there, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rossetti, if you could hold that thought, I do want to go to that document.
Sure.
But I'm going to look over at Ms. Furch real quickly and follow up on the question from Senator Anderson. Does our are our truckers out there in the trucking industry, are they very much aware of this lifetime ban that was just referenced? I'm just curious.
Mr. Chairman, Sheila Furch, Wyoming Trucking Association. Most of them are. They understand with the commercial driver's license, they're held to higher standards and that certain commissions of certain felonies, as Mr. Rossetti talked about, have either the 10-year ban when then they can come back and reapply, or they can, it's a lifetime ban.
Okay.
Do we like mandates? No. Do we understand some of them? You bet. Do we want our drivers out there dispensing or distributing drugs from a commercial vehicle? No. Do we want them involved with human trafficking? No. So I would have to say the majority of, particularly companies, maybe not some of the individual independent contractors, but most of the companies are very aware of any kind of change in the commercial driver's licensing. And I think what Mr. Rossetti also said was that while there might not be any implications if we don't do it, it certainly may lead to an implication of our drivers not being able to get a commercial driver's license issued in the state of Wyoming. That's a concern. That's a huge concern.
Thank you, Sheila. Appreciate that. Any questions of the Trucking Association? Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at how the recommendation to change that, it says it is for life, but if we look at the handout that was given to us, which is 383.51A6, it does allow it. It says that there is a process that a state may reinstate any driver after 10 years. And of course, it goes through the requirements that it would have, that a driver would have to go through rehabilitation and stuff like that. If we go through a recommendation put before us, I would like to see that we actually follow the federal recommendation that we do have the ability that if someone does go through and commits a felony and goes through that process, that if they do their 10 years and they've paid their debt to society, that we do offer the ability for them to at least reapply and try to get themselves back on track.
And I think he means, don't you think, Ms. Furch, or
Mr.
whatever.
Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Representative.
We certainly want, like I said, we don't like mandates, but we certainly want to be compliant with what the rule says. And if there is the ability to reapply, certainly that's something we'd want to consider.
Ms. Furch, thank you. I appreciate you jumping up on the fly like that. Mr. Rossetti, now back to you. And Representative Burt, just just reference this document and maybe you can take it from there. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Burt, that is actually a very good question. It actually relates back to the question that Senator Anderson asked about the DUI. And if you look through this, so what you have in front of you is part of 49 CFR 38351, which is where the disqualification comes from. 6 does have a provision for a reinstatement after a lifetime disqualification. However, as you turn this page and you get into the table that's referenced there, I've given you the part that talks of this specific crime, and it talks about life, not eligible for a 10-year reinstatement. So for this particular thing, that provision of the 10-year reinstatement does not apply. That is the interpretation and the way the code actually reads from federal motor carriers. So in this case, that provision 6 doesn't apply for this particular offense. Moving on, then you see there on page 2 of that handout that it references that definition of severe forms of human trafficking of persons. So I put that here on the bottom of page 2, so you guys could read that over, and that's really wherein my recommendation to reference all of our Article 7 in human trafficking comes from. As you read this definition, it really aligns with the way our human trafficking law and statute reads. And instead of trying to redefine terms we've already defined in other parts of code, I just thought we could align it this way. So that's really all that's here. The rest of this handout for you guys is in fact Article 7, the human trafficking part of Wyoming statute. So I tried to put that all there. I apologize I didn't get it to you earlier. I didn't even think I'd need it until I started looking through this and realized we'd probably have this discussion. So that's really the handout that's sitting there for you. Certainly would answer any additional questions.
Mr. Rossetti, that's helpful, and appreciate you gathering this up for us. I did notice that your recommendation with respect to language is a person may be disqualified. And I think I'm probably good with that, but I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if you thought about shall or
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. The may, it was an existing statute. So, I mean, that had already been through the body and had already been agreed upon for the drug felonies.
I think the question for us, Mr. Rossetti, is just whether or not this human trafficking piece is a different kettle of fish than a drug violation. And that goes back to Representative Burt's comments. And
sure.
Representative, did you have something else?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I just need some clarification on how language is, because I'm not a lawyer on that. When we look at the purpose, we're trying to get back into federal requirement. And I understand that. And then we're talking about, the extreme human trafficking. And I understand in that table, it says under extreme human trafficking, that it is life with, no reinstatement. I get that. But when we look at the recommendations to change our statute 315-305E, it actually talks about all or any felony, not specifically human trafficking. So if we're going to follow the federal guideline on human trafficking, then yeah, I can see where your table says there's no 10-year reinstatement. But if we're going to go with all or any felony, I still think we should be able to have that number 6 in there to where anything outside of the human trafficking side of it would still have an option for a driver to rehabilitate themselves and actually go back after 10 years. Am I just misunderstanding how 6 under CFR under the 6 is a little different than what the table is on what your recommendation is for any felony?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burt, I'm not sure it's a misunderstanding. I think it might just be at the time that the previous statute was written, this was the language that they used. I just tried to mirror it. I think having heard that comment from you, and if the committee decides to move forward with this, I could certainly work with LSO to craft some language that might better reflect what the committee believes we should try to achieve here.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Representative. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So along that same line, if you were to look at page number 6, 62703, human trafficking in the second degree, where it talks about if a person recklessly recruits, transports, or transfers. So certainly I understand first degree, no question, willful and knowledgeable or knowingly. Second degree, I could certainly see some arguments there where maybe you trusted a wingman that led you astray or something like that. I would just like, encourage you to consider that, because again, a lifetime ban, that's a pretty serious deal. And I think that if there's going to be a lifetime ban, then the person, the defendant, should have been knowingly participating, as opposed to maybe a reckless, which, boy, the degree of that can be pretty broad. So maybe consider whether or not second degree should be considered under that. So thank you.
Mr. Rossetti, did you pick up on that suggestion?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree.
Okay, thank you. And Representative, I would just say that if we do make a motion here at the end of the day to move forward on this, our motion can reflect any and all of what a couple of our good representatives have brought up this afternoon. So let's keep that in mind, and we can give that directive to our staff. So anything else? Mr. Rossetti, proceed.
Mr. Chairman, the last thing that I'd like to bring before the committee today is something that Ms. Jarvis and myself have been discussing recently, and it involves House Bill 86, or Enrolled Act 25 from the last session. I think it's important to be here. A couple of co-sponsors on the bill were here. I haven't had a chance to reach out to you guys. I apologize. This kind of came up quick, but there were two things in the bill that I just want to bring to everyone's attention. And if people don't remember, this was the bill that allowed dirt bikes to be registered to be used on roadways. One of the issues that has come up, or just a point of clarification that we were asked to find out from the treasurer's group, was that the registration that is specified in this bill is actually a permanent registration. So the language that is in this bill, basically, once you register that dirt bike, it does not expire until you transfer ownership. So this would be the one class of vehicle, with the exception of the Pioneer vehicles that have that form of registration. Clearly a policy decision, but I don't know if it was never discussed during the discussion. So I just wanted to bring it to the body's attention, just for some consideration and some guidance as to how we implement this going forward. The other point that's in this piece of legislation that I wanted the group to be aware of, because there's some work being done on it, is this legislation closely mirrored the multi-purpose vehicle registration. And if you guys recall, if you were around when that was passed, those are able to be used on all highways except interstate highways. So this language mirrored that. That was a good policy decision, I think, from our standpoint. I think as the body, that seemed to be the direction we wanted to go. The reason I bring it up today is interstate highway means right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence, not just the paved surface. It's right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence. So as we start thinking about potentially exploring the avenue of some motorized pathways or things like that, and using that as a marketing tool to potentially generate revenue for tourism, this does provide some conflict as to whether or not a pathway could be developed within that right-of-way. So there's some work being done there. I wanted this group to be aware of that. There may be some language that gets proposed to clarify the surface of interstates. But I wanted this group to be aware of that, because that is a potential issue if we move forward and try to use that as a way to generate some revenue within the state. Other highways, it's already allowable. It's just specifically the interstates that this issue exists. So I wanted to bring those two things to the attention of the committee, and if there's any questions, I'd certainly answer.
Really appreciate it, Taylor. So to go back to the registration piece, I'm getting the feeling that the feedback to you was that we might ought to consider fixing that, and all other vehicles like that, it's a yearly registration. Is that the idea?
Mr. Chairman, the question was merely, I think, a real question from the treasurers as we were looking through it. You know, if you go down there with your normal motorcycle, as Representative Burt drove up here, you know, he's going to register that every year.
Right.
But if that same motorcycle happened to be a dirt bike or qualify as a dirt bike, he's going to register that vehicle one time, and that registration is valid until he actually transfers ownership. It was merely a question in that, again, that this vehicle, so that dirt bike and Pioneer vehicles would be the only two vehicles that we actually do permanent registration on.
Yeah, Representative Bird's going, so what's the problem with that? No, I think committee, we may want to consider a quick little fix, Bill, on that. If somebody wants to make that note, we may
Mr.
want
Chairman,
to consider modifying that. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, as I remember the discussion on this, there was a lobby from a group that lobbied hard for this one-time registration for their dirt bikes. And they were very, very effective in getting that done. I agree we should change that, but you're going to run into a buzzsaw.
That completely got past me, Senator. I've got to admit it to you. I saw that bill in committee, brought it out on the floor, and I was not aware that there was a hard lobby that you would never have to register every year like we do every other vehicle. But I learned something new every day hanging around with all of you. Representative, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question revolves around the statement that the state could potentially see or lose revenue by allowing access in our right-of-way fence to fence. How do you see that playing out? I know that there is a possibility of developing, especially in our Southwest Wyoming off-road trail system and trying to move forward with that, which I completely support. But how would the state directly receive revenue by allowing access?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Baker, if I gave any illusion that this would prevent us from or directly generate revenue, I apologize for that. Simply what I was trying to say was, as the laws is written right now, the off-road vehicles and then now these dirt bikes in our state statutes are prohibited from the interstate highways. And that highway means right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence. So they cannot be operated in that right-of-way at all right now. So if there were a grand plan in order to create a statewide network of trails, and it included putting some of that trail within that right-of-way, these vehicles would not be able to ride on it by state law. So if it were going to generate money for tourism, you couldn't use those segments in order to do that because they would not be able to use that actual highway. And again, the potential fix there is to clarify that they're not prohibited from interstate highways, but instead they are prohibited from the paved portion of the interstate highways, which would then allow for something to be designed out near the right-of-way fence for the sole purpose of these vehicles to be run. And that would be a potential fix to help that network of trails be developed.
Follow up? Any questions?
Mr.
Representative Stivers, you got a
Chairman,
question?
yeah.
You good?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add to that,
Director
we
Reiner, go
certainly
ahead.
saw this as a inhibitor to our current efforts to enhance the economic development plan in Southwest Wyoming, which we're working in full partnership, with lots of people. And I saw something, well, we got to change the statute to make this thing legal. So that's what Mr. Rose.
So my question, Director and Mr. Rossetti, is I think we're all trying to think about a piece of a trail coming out into the road right of way. I know I am. What are the problems with that? I mean, we don't really like utilizing our right of ways that way. But on the other hand, I'm willing to think outside the box here. You referenced property that is on the other side of the fence, I think just now, did you not? We don't, tell me about that right of way. Do we have additional right of way beyond that fence that we can access? Can we condemn something? Is there?
Mr. Chairman, this gets into one of this complex issues that we've been working through is by statute. Your direction to me as a director and to our engineers is to buy the minimum required right of way to support the road. And that's because you're taking it from somebody. I mean, that's how it works. I mean, it was somebody's land and now it's a public road. And I respect that. And so we minimize that. And so our long-standing guidance has been no activities in the right of way. Guys, that's for you, for your safety. So if you spin off that road, you don't hit anything or anybody. And so now we're starting to look at, hey, what else can we do in there? So lots of initiatives in broadband. We're working through those. And now we have the off-road vehicle concept in the right of way. We did say, yes, we're gonna work to get to a yes here. And so as we've explored that, is we've really come up with some guiding principles and a draft policy that YDOT will use as we go down this road. And I don't have it memorized, but it's generically, it says you shall not come on the asphalt because of speed differential. If there is a water obstacle in the right of way, you're gonna have to build a bridge or something over it so you don't go in it. Because part of our NEPA agreement when we put in the road was to stay out of the water. And so we get it, and that's federal. And so we've got to work through a bunch of these eaches. And so the other issue in there policy wise was depending on the width, some places are wider than not. And I don't know what the specific we ended up with, but if we get really close, we'll put some sort of barrier between the trail, the ORV trail, and the hard road surface, whether it's a fence so that the ORV can't come onto the road, because it's just what we don't want is a fatality.
No, I think that.
And so those are the type
How
of
many
issues
miles are we
we're working
talking
through.
about, Director? How?
At this point,
A
Mr.
great
Chairman,
amount
we're
of them, or-
talking about 3 miles in Evanston, but it's a trial. I mean, I think it's a precursor of things to come. And so my guidance to the theme was, hey, let's get a policy that works statewide, and let's not just approach it as this little section. This will be our test section, but I think we've got to have the policy right so that we can all be in agreement. Here's how we're going to do this to facilitate economic development in our state while keeping the users of the ORV safe and not providing a really bad day for a trucker that hits one.
Right. I appreciate you guys working in that direction, and was interested in that just yesterday, mentioned it to you. So I like the idea of being able to either barrier or fence that if we're going to roll through and I'm glad to hear it's not a huge amount of mileage. I don't think we'd want to get to where we're driving 10 miles down the interstate highway. 3 seems a lot to me, but I appreciate you guys working on that. So what we could do, committee, on this front is consider a draft and see what that looks like. Because the department is working with Southwest Wyoming, and let's at least roll it up so that we can see what the thing looks like in the second meeting. So that could be on our list that we'll take up right about now, pretty soon. Okay. So, Mr. Rossetti, thanks for those 2 suggestions. And anything else that you've got for us?
No, sir.
Director Reiner.
Mr. Chairman, I think we'll rest.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to offer any public comment on this final section of our agenda, which is statutory considerations. Mary Beth, do we have anybody online?
Mr. Chairman, we do not.
Okay, thank you. Anybody in the room like to comment on anything over the last few minutes? Okay, we'll close public testimony. And committee, that gets us to the end of our agenda. Before I come to you, Heather, for any thoughts that you have, I'm just going to throw out a few things, and Mr. Co-Chairman, I would invite you to do the same thing. I think what I'd like to do, committee, is to go back to about lunchtime. We've had about 4 different categories on our agenda that we've gone through. We had funding, we had the overview of the alternative vehicle conversation, and then we got into statutory change. I would be interested in any motions that we would have that we would want to carry forward to the next committee. And I hope that's directive enough that we can start a conversation. Mr. Co-Chairman.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I would make a motion. Maybe I will. Give me a minute on that. But I've made a couple notes, and I guess it would depend on the will of the committee, whether we wanted to reconsider the automated vehicle bill. And that I know there's a considerable amount of disagreement on that. I think I would consider it mostly as a pilot project. One of the reasons being that right now there's nothing. They can run any of these automated vehicles they want on Wyoming roads. This puts some control on it. And that's my concern. I have some, I'll just describe them as unique ideas, what to do with that. So I guess maybe I will make that as a motion that we reconsider the automated vehicle bill.
Motion on the floor. Any, do I hear a second? Seconded by Representative McGuire to at least reconsider. Is it your thought, just to clarify the motion, Mr. Co-Chair, to ask our staff to just redraft that bill or to draft it as it appeared to the legislature last session, or?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure, because I've had a discussion with the individuals who testified on that, and what I told them is we'd consider it if they will all get together, and I guess we could put a draft together for them to look at and come back, and all of the various people, groups, whatever, agree on what it is we're doing. Because I'm not going to take anything, I wouldn't take anything forward where all the automotive people say this is what we want, and the insurance people say we won't participate. I want them all on the same page with the same information, and that they all agree. So I guess that's a caveat to my motion.
So I'll go to Senator Pappas after Senator Anderson. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, last year, and some people weren't on this committee last year, we spent a lot of time on this, a lot of time. And we, in fact, asked the insurance guys and the AV guys to get together and come back to us, and they still couldn't come to an agreement. I'm against doing anything. I think what we're doing right now is just fine. Let them go ahead and test. Let them go ahead and do what they're going to do. We're not going to get agreement from the insurance guys and the testers of the ADS systems. And so we can stay out of it for once. So I'm a no on this bill.
Okay. Further discussion on the motion? Are you ready for the question?
Yes.
Question.
All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No?
No.
I think the noes maybe have it, but let's have a show of hands. Those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, those opposed, please raise your hand. That motion has failed. We will not take up alternative vehicles as a committee, but certainly any one of us can do that on our own. Back up to the funding piece. Mr. Co-Chairman, I know that you had a thought there, and others may have had a thought under the funding piece of our agenda for maybe a draft bill. Do you want to go to that?
How do you want to do this? You want a motion or just discussion?
I think discussion, and we can, I just want to make sure that we cover all bases and
All right.
instruct our staff accordingly.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I had 2 concepts, and I'll just stick with one at a time. One was on the fees for oversized, overweight loads. Staff will pass out House Bill 24 with some 120 or 241, I'm sorry,
House
with
Bill,
some addition. That came up last session.
just for clarification to our senators, the co-chairman had drafted a bill on the other side, gentlemen, and it did not come out of the House and over to the Senate. And it was related to overweight, oversized vehicles. So
And
that's
thank you, Mr.
you
Chairman.
bet. Thank you.
So
Mr.
one thing with this was not a bill to generate money. It was not a funding bill per se. It was a bill to start bringing up our fee schedule to what they should be. I know we'll talk about that probably the next meeting. So I might be a little bit premature, but it gives us something to get started for next meeting. And I would tell you in this draft, ignore the dollar amounts for a variety of reasons. The main one being, it would be my intention to take the existing fees, go back to when they were last updated and merely update them to match inflation since then. Not to put an additional burden on. And things increase in cost over time. And by not doing that, we're allowing the other drivers of the state to pick up costs that should correctly go to those using these fees. The addition to this, and I had committed to the industry when we talked about this last time, that I would include in the bill a provision and the ability, and again, I would consider this as a very, very rough draft. The ability to purchase an annual permit rather than a per trip permit. And the amount of money and the controls on that would need to be well worked. It would have to also be a consideration whether the permit stays with the truck or the company and how that would work. So there are a lot of unanswered questions. But that's the bill in a nutshell, to start bringing our fee schedule for the department up to what it should be currently. Some of the fees on these loads have not been updated since 1993. And I think all you have to do is look at the cost of a vehicle since 1993. And they've probably increased by a factor of 3 or 4. But these fees haven't been raised in that long on some of them.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. Absent any vehement objections, we'll just look for that bill at the next meeting, and would ask staff to take that up, and maybe, Mr. Co-Chairman, utilize the resources you need to draft that other piece into the bill and get it ready to show it off in September.
All right.
Okay.
I will do that,
Mr. Chairman.
All right. Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I might be wrong about this, and it's been 10 years or 12 years now since I've been in the business, but when we had an accident, our insurance always asked for our permits. And if we have a permit like this on page 7, that's just a permit for anything, I'm not sure what we could show them. And maybe the WTA could bring us up to date on that as to how that would work, if it would fit all right for the insurance purposes.
Mr. Chairman, Sheila
Go ahead,
Furch,
Ms.
Wyoming
Furch.
Trucking Association. Senator Anderson, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what insurance would require and if that would suffice. I can certainly find out. We have carriers who, excuse me, have been talking about this subject ever since the first bill came out. And certainly that will be something that we can discuss, and I can have that answer for you at the next meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Furch. If you would work with the co-chairman, and we would really appreciate that. I like the idea, and I'd like to be able to do that for our trucking industry, but I don't know how it might work. So,
Mr. Chairman, we're happy to work. We had a lot of carriers that were very worried about the bill when it was first discussed. The topic of annual permits, lots of states do annual permits, so I know it's doable,
Okay.
and we're certainly happy to work with him on that.
that's good. Thank you. Mr. Co-Chairman, you had another item for our consideration here at the end of the
Mr.
meeting?
Chairman, I do. Staff just handed out a 1-pager at the top in bold. It says EV charging stations. These were nothing more than typed up thoughts, because I knew you could never read my handwriting. And this was a thought I had probably about 7 o'clock at night somewhere near Arlington on I-80 while I was driving home. But our fueling stations, our service stations have numerous requirements, and you've seen some of them in the presentation today. And I thought, why don't we just model what we're doing with electric vehicle charging after those? And so that's where this comes from. This is the 100,000 foot view, if you want to look at it that way. That we address this issue like service stations. That if the state has their own, they have their own, but they'll have to pay the fees as well. That was just a thought I had, and these are in no particular order. Currently, service stations pay a service station annual fee of $25. You saw a recommendation to potentially raise that. So each charging facility would be assessed a fee, a charge of $25 for the facility. I believe, and I couldn't find it again in statute, I saw it one time, I believe there is a $25 per pump nozzle charge on service stations. So each plug or connector would have that same fee. Included in that is each charging facility must be metered to the amount of electricity used for charging. And I've looked at some of these ones at hotels and they are metered already. They have to be licensed as a business in Wyoming. Again, that's what we require of our service stations. And I put down there is a fee of 15 cents per kilowatt hour for each kilowatt hour of charging. Rapid charge on a Tesla, I did some research, would be about a $15 fee, I believe. All charging has to be metered, including that at residential charging stations. The reason for that is that most people that have these feel that they kind of get to skate on road use charges and taxes by charging at home. So they buy the vehicle, they charge at home. The state never sees any money, frankly, and they use the roads. I think that's unfair to the rest of the people. Because the fee would be collected by the utility based on the metering, I'd give the utility, let them retain 5% of the fee for administrative cost. If they want to separately meter their charging, that's up to the individual at home. But if they don't, then the fee would attach to the entire building. That you'd have no other way of doing that. We already identify EVs on vehicle registration, and I think the new YDOT computer system can handle correlation between where they're parked and the vehicle itself. You'd need some sort of penalty for non-compliance. I'd apply it to all plug-in vehicles, including plug-in hybrids. If we do this, I'd be interested probably in getting rid of the annual $200 sticker for EVs. Probably need to look at what we would do for interstate trucks, although there aren't any yet, there will be. This also addresses the out-of-state issue, because if they do a rapid charge at a hotel or a freestanding station, the state would still get equivalent money to a fuel tax. And I just threw the last one in as a givey to the fossil fuel industry. We'll cut that rate to 10 cents a kilowatt hour if they specifically use coal, gas, nuclear to power the facility. So that's it, kind of in a nutshell. I can proceed if the committee thinks it's a worthwhile idea. If not, I won't. And it's something to consider. That was all it was something to put on the table to say, here's a concept.
Mr. Co-Chairman, there's a lot in there.
I do a lot of driving.
There's a
and
lot in
thinking.
there. That might be 3 bills. I don't know. Committee, any thoughts, anything you want to comment about with regard to this? Senator Anderson?
I think there is a lot of something in here, and we should consider it the next meeting. Maybe the LSO can flesh this out a little bit and give us something that we could use, maybe. But there's a lot of topics here, and I think that last one is unconstitutional, even though I really like it.
committee, I think I feel pretty much the same way for what it's worth. I don't see any problem with, well, I'll hold that thought because Representative McGuire has a thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one other item to consider, and that would be that commercial charging stations, if you were to put them on a fair basis with our commercial fuel distributors, they have to have certified pumps. And so with these commercial stations, should they have a certified meter?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I think so. I had thought of that when, whether you certify the meter itself or whether you certify the charge at the connector. And just, I was trying to keep it to one page for discussion purposes. And that's the only reason. But yes, I think they should, which would again require some things probably of weights and measurements in Department of Agriculture to certify those. I haven't talked to any agency on this.
Committee, I'm inclined to, I think it's fine for the co-chairman to work with our staff, and if you can get something, put together, I think it's fine for us to take it up and visit about whether or not we want to get going forward on some charging station legislation. We can talk about it. We either pass it or we don't. But at the next meeting, I think it's appropriate that we're looking at this issue. So I've had a couple of hands up. Representative McGuire first, and then Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just encourage the good co-chairman to maybe consider eliminating the last two lines. I think that would just muddy the waters.
Okay.
Representative Henderson, and then back to Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like some of what the chairman has proposed here. And I might suggest considering, looking at some of our rest stops in terms of potential build out of the pilot idea for electric charging stations, maybe one or two, or however many we think we can do. I know there's some businesses, they have this deal over in Utah every year for the Energy Summit. And there's companies that are already gone to states like Hawaii and so on to set up these charging stations. And it's not just electric, it's also solar. So I think we have some potential opportunity at the rest areas. For example, the idea of having it certified and metered and some kind of a charge, and then provide some sort of fund or revenue, if you will, for the maintenance of those rest stops.
So in other words, just a public-private partnership.
Yes, sir.
Of some kind.
Yes, sir. So I think it's definitely worth pursuing.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, we heard about that in previous meetings, and the state cannot get into charging stations or fuel stations or hydrogen stations or any kind of stations. So that kind of lets the rest areas out. And one thing that would really get their attention on this bill, if you want to throw it in there, Oregon requires that you have a person put the fuel in the car because it's dangerous. And if you're going to meter it and everything, maybe you put that somebody has to hook him up. And that'd be kind of an employment thing for every one of those. There'd be guys standing there hooking you up. Be kind of fun. Be kind of fun to discuss that.
That's a promotional billboard. We can hook up a brother or hook up a sister.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, not talking about hooking each other up, but Senator Anderson is correct.
Yeah.
Except for a new law, a new guidance that just came out from the Biden administration about 2 weeks ago, and I'm not fully versed in it, that basically has recognized this issue of electronic vehicle charging stations and said, hey, we think we're going to go down the road of allowing rest areas to be used for that. So it's a dramatic change, and I'm not fully versed even in being able to brief you on the specific laws, except to say, I think the representative makes a good point, and the law has now, we think, changed, and we should at least explore that. My recommendation, sir.
Totally agree. Thank you. Director, we'll count on you to bring that back to us if you would. And Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this would be to the director. So has there been any discussion as to the markup that's going to be allowed? Is there going to be any regulating with regard to, so for example, with fuel, there's all kinds of regulations about how much and where and when. Has there been any kind of discussion that you've seen on a federal level about markup?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative McGuire, not that I've seen, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I think that's research that you expect me to do and my staff. Well, I think it's part of the process. So we'll just, I mean, I think as we go down this road, there's a lot of learning, and it's a fast changing environment. And so I think we just keep each other updated and versed as we go. Because it's a valid question, but I don't know.
Okay. So let's put that on the list, Heather, if you would. The co-chairman's thoughts regarding the charging stations. And I'm looking all the way down to Representative O'Hearn, and I'm going to kind of go down the road a little bit, especially to just make sure that each of us has an opportunity to weigh in. So anything you can think of, Representative, that you want to have us look at in the second meeting, or any suggestions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just, until the EVs get here, I think we're, as an extractive state, I don't want to be ahead of the ball game. I know they're coming, but I want them to be paying their own way. So I'm very concerned about that. Also with the AVs, we fought very hard that they have a black box on them. If it's a commercial black box, like a regular vehicle driving around in, you miss the human interaction of what happened before and during the accident. If it's just an AV, you only see the mechanical data. So
Right.
I'm
Well,
pretty
I
adamant
agree.
about making sure that that doesn't go away.
I appreciate it, Representative. I think those are the debates that we're going to be having on these pieces as we look at them. That AV one, of course, went away at this point, but could come back as an individual bill. But thank you. Anything else, I'll sure come back to you. But Representative Steibar, do you have anything for going forward in the interim?
Not at this time. I'm just adamant that we don't get into the car charging business. That's not government's job. That belongs to the private industry. So I'm adamant we don't do this.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a clarification. This wasn't to advocate for the state getting into charging vehicles. We don't run service stations either. It was to start putting some language into how we will allow them and get our road use fees from electric vehicles. And it was a concept. I would object to anything to the state running service stations or doing any public provisions for providing power to electric vehicles or fuel to combustion engines or anything like that.
Thank you for that clarification. Anything else, Representative Steibar? Okay, Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this a general request or just related to EVs?
It is. My thought is I don't want to miss anything as we give any directives to staff in preparation for our next meeting, which I think is in September, Heather, is that right?
It's in August, isn't it?
August? I
in
apologize for saying September. Our next meeting is when these issues will be taken up, Representative Obermuller. Does that help? So
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it does. I do have an ask.
That would be terrific.
All right. YDOT and the funding working group had one significant limitation, Mr. Chairman. They could not consider, like we can, the use of existing cash flow streams to fund YDOT and the construction industry. I would ask the committee to direct LSO to report at the next meeting the financial impact to YDOT of redirecting the statutory 1% severance tax to roads and bridges and its estimated future impact if we did that. Part of this request of LSO would be to consider inflation proofing of the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and the extent to which inflation proofing is currently prepaid due to discretionary contributions in previous years. And an estimation of the extended life of that prepayment based on inflationary models. So that is the ask, Mr. Chairman, a report on these matters for our August meeting. And I would work with LSO to work out the specifics of this ask if the committee is favorable. Thank you.
Committee, if you're like me, that was a lot late in the day. I liked pieces of what I heard Representative Obermuller. Any vehement concerns over, I don't have any problem with that being part of what we would look at. And so Representative, if you would work with staff, I think that could be an item on the agenda, and there's no reason why we can't look at it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I think it's important. Thank you for that, Representative. Let's go right on down the road. Representative Henderson, anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier we had an invite from our congressional delegation, Mr. Ziegler and so forth, to reach out to him for assistance. I would move that we consider, I've moved to send a committee letter to our delegation, signed by the chairman and approved by the chairman, to help inform and to request our delegation's assistance regarding the top 3 unfunded critical transportation projects for Wyoming. We all listened and looked at the information related to significant needs over the next, funded or costed over 10 years, and it added up to a considerable sum. But I think when all said and done, having looked at all this and listened to all this, I know I don't know what the top 3 most critical projects are. And I have some examples of priority projects, having listened the last couple of days. One is the truck parking area near Evanston. One is unfunded bridge projects. And the third one relates to, the 3rd lane for truck use on the I-80. That's just a few that I've thought about. And then if I sure would appreciate the committee's view on that.
Committee, that's a little bit different kind of motion. That's not just an ask out of our staff for the next meeting. That is something that would represent our committee, our joint committee. So I have a motion on the floor in that regard. Do I have a second on the motion? Do I have a second on the motion? Senator Furphy, or was that Senator McEwen? Was that a second? It was Senator Furphy. Okay, discussion.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just try to simplify it a little bit. I went over a lot of stuff there, but it could be just a simple highlight of the top 3 critical projects that we know about here in our state with the help of the good director. During this critical time, we have a lot of money coming. We have a couple opportunities to appropriate it. And I just think it might be good to take a gut check and just help inform everybody where our top 3 are. And it could be as simple as that.
Senator Anderson?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I really like this idea. I think you and Representative Burkhardt ought to get together and write a letter and just kind of become a full-time legislator.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would like to see more specifics before I attach my name to something like that. I think if you ask everyone here in the room right now, what are your top 3 projects, you're going to get different answers. And I'm not sure what this does other than say these are our top projects, and what happens if there's not money for those projects, but money for others. I mean, I don't have a problem, contacting our delegation's offices saying, hey, do everything you can to get us every penny.
I think those are some good thoughts, Mr. Co-Chairman. And Representative, I like where you're going with the motion. I think when we get down into specificity, like 3 different projects like that, I'd be more inclined to think that as a transportation committee, we might want to be more robust. If we're going to send a letter back to our congressional delegation with an ask or an encouragement, how about if we give a little bit more thought to this thing I'm very happy, to work with YDOT and others and sign a letter. I just want it to be everything we need it to be. That's kind of my caution. Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, when I seconded, when I heard Senator Barrasso's representative today, he said, we'd like to hear from you on what your priorities are. So that's where I was headed with that. I think we should respond to them with a letter saying, here's some of our needs. I don't know that we need to get into specifics to that detail, but I think it makes sense there, since they wanted to hear from us anyway. I think this committee should put something together to them. Thank you.
Senator Pappas.
Yeah, I agree. I think the letter is a good idea. My caution is that we have not set priorities. And those three that were mentioned, certainly, I don't know that they are our priorities. I think
Maybe just go on.
I think we need to get with the department and I don't know whether whatever the department's priorities become our priorities. That's something that the committee will have to decide. But, the unfunded bridges, certainly there's going to be a high priority somewhere. The third lane, I'm not so sure that that's going to, on I-80, if that's a high priority or not. We really didn't discuss it. It came up today, but I didn't really hear that was a high priority item. So I'm just really concerned about the specifics of what goes into the letter. I think the letter is good, but I think we need to understand what our priorities really are, and I don't think we do.
Committee, I'm going to ask that Director Reiner, maybe what we could do here, I think we've got a good idea on the floor. Maybe it's just not quite ready for prime time. If on your behalf, the Transportation Joint Committee were to write such a letter, would you be willing to give some thought to what might be contained in that letter? And maybe we bring this back to the next meeting, members of the committee, and then we can look at it together, feel good about what we're sending back to the congressional delegation. With your help, Director, does that sound like maybe a way forward on this?
Mr. Chairman, I think that makes a lot of sense. As I would have to work that, I certainly, as a member of the executive branch, need to clear those concepts with my boss on that side. I think one of the questions I'd ask you is there's probably a big difference and a decision to be made on, is this a policy suggestion letter in terms of, hey, we support, formula in, maintaining large formulas, and we support less regulation, or are we specifically asking for money for specific projects? And because there's a big difference between the two. I think the Representative Henderson was talking about specific projects, which we could. I think typically if we're going down that road, it's almost a call to Mr. Ziegler and say, hey, is there any available funding? Because otherwise I'm not sure what you've accomplished. And I think a letter from this committee is a silver bullet, and it should be fired with precision and with great accuracy and to great effect.
I think that's very well put, Director. And I think that catches the sentiment of several of the senators here, the co-chairman. I really like Representative Henderson bringing this idea forward. How about if we flesh it out? And I think I'd be more inclined to lean toward the policy front. I like the formula piece that you just threw out, for example. I don't think there's any question that somewhere in that letter we could indicate here are some of the major concerns that we have. We've got a choke point at Green River, or we have, there's a list of 10 things that came up the last 2 days that I know your commission has worked with and whatever. Maybe you could, if you would, Director, give some thought to what we may want to, we're very interested in being strong advocates for for what's going on here with our transportation infrastructure. I agree with you. We want it to be precision. We want to get every ounce out of it. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It does, and we'll put some thought into that because I think it warrants extensive thought and
And
coordination.
maybe us co-chairmen
Yes, sir.
can maybe visit with you as we go on. Representative Henderson, does that sound like something that us chairmen can work on? We won't go anywhere without the rest of you guys having an opportunity to look at. Is that, what are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, at least we're talking about it, right? I mean, you take in a lot of information, a lot of competing needs, short of money. I think that makes sense. And so with my second's concurrence, I'll withdraw the motion.
Thank you, Representative. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, what I was going to say is we would also need to discuss this with our management, House and Senate management. I think they need to know we're doing things like this before we do them.
I think that's a very good suggestion. Senator Furphy, you seconded that motion. Are you okay to withdraw that? Okay. We'll work on that, committee. Committee, among other things, we did have some suggestions underneath the statutory update that was provided by Mr. Rossetti. I believe there were 3 bills, Heather, that we may want to consider, under what was presented to us. Did you keep track of those for us?
Mr. Chairman, I may have, although only 2 are coming to mind on the statutory updates. Mr. Chairman, there was the statutory update or a bill that would be regarding disqualification and cancellation of drivers of CDL privileges. And then there would be a bill to fix the mess, to fix the challenges that have been identified in the other legislation.
The dirt bike bill?
Yes.
Yeah, I had that written down as well.
And then, but now I just need to search to see if you're remembering 3. Let me search.
The third one, I believe, was the right-of-way bill, Heather, with regard to ATVs entering the interstate road right-of-way.
Mr. Chairman, I was mistakenly thinking that was part of the dirt bike bill, but I do think probably that could very well be for it to be single subject better as a separate bill.
I think so. And I just think a fix on the little dirt bike bill is the way maybe we'd like to look at it for the second meeting. Because that's the kind of bill that might just fly through. Anyway, those 3 and committee, what am I missing? What would we like to take it? Thank you. I'm going to keep going, by golly. I didn't mean to stop. Representative Burke, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first one was in regards to a recommendation from Mr. Rossetti, changing that language. I think we need to rework that language on that statute 315305 to add in the federal code in there that allows that 10-year rehabilitation to be able to get that license back, aside from the human trafficking side of it, which according to the table doesn't allow for the 10-year reinstatement. Without that in there, I don't think I could support the way it's going, but allowing a 10-year and coming back into it for the reinstatement as a federal looks at it, I could be on board with that one. On the EV side of it, this one doesn't really give me a warm and fuzzy on this one. A couple of things that I do have some primary concerns on. If I buy an EV vehicle and I decide to use a solar system to charge my vehicle, I would have to register my vehicle as an EV. But if I use a solar system, I would not, well, if we run it as it's currently written, I would be forced to put in another meter at my cost. And I haven't had a meter put in a residential home. I have no idea what that would cost from the electrical company. So if I use a solar system, which would be my choice, and I don't put in a residential meter for that, now we're going to tell everybody that the entire home, the electrical use of the home would now be considered at an additional fee on top of what I'm already paying for electricity. My primary concern that I think that's just a well overreach of the broad scope of the government telling me as a homeowner what I can and can't do in my home. That's a killer for me right there. So looking at that issue there, forcing a homeowner, unless we're gonna pay every homeowner to put a meter in, which we don't have that kind of money, but telling a homeowner what they have to do at their home, I can't get on board with that one. So those are some of the big concerns I have on that one. But a lot of the EV charging stations, I don't think it's the government's role on that side to start to work on that. I would have to kind of keep an eye on it to see where it goes. But those are my two primary are the residential side of it.
Thank you, Representative Byrd. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to make sure, Heather, that you maybe would consider that provision, which would split those two issues presented by Mr. Rossetti and reflective of the representative's concerns.
Mr. Chairman, that was noted. My mistake, I should have clarified during the discussion. Mr. Rossetti said several times that he might be able to, and that's not saying to the committee, he said it already, but I'm just meaning I noted that he was indicating taking into concern or taking under advisement the different concerns that the committee was raising, and that we would work together to address them. Because there were more than the 10-year. There was also, well, I guess it was the same 10-year, but on a slightly different, looking at the different levels of the crimes that Representative McGuire had raised, and just making sure that it addresses a lot of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rossetti, for working with our staff a little bit on that. Yeah, let's keep moving. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being brief, I just want to thank you for the opportunity these last 2 days for the education and the information that's been provided. I think, continuing the discussion is key. I also think that, we can't put our heads in the sand when it comes to these discussions and just say that, we're going to deal with it if it gets here, because clearly it's coming. We just look back at technology. We started with glasses, and then we have contacts. Now we have LASIK surgery. Technology is going to continue to advance. The idea of electric vehicles is actually a little exciting to me. We have huge deposits in our area of lithium. So the possibility of potentially utilizing that resource in the future as this continues to grow, I think is great for our area. So I'd like to see that. I want to continue the discussions. And so, working to get a yes, like you said, is important to me, and keeping the situational awareness in front of us is important. So I want to continue these discussions. I look forward to the budget discussions coming up in June, and I would love to have some more information about what we need to do to try to do our part as a committee for these the American Rescue Plan money. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I agree with you. Our task really is to solve problems for the state, and let's just keep charging. So, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as Ms. Jarvis mentioned, and I don't know if it needs to be put in as a motion, but in order to certainly to move forward and be in compliance with 49 CFR 383.51, if we can do it without including 62703 second degree, then to get at least an advisory opinion from the federal government about that, so that we know whether it has to be included or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Mr. Co-Chairman, I'll come back to you. How about that? Let's go down. Senator McEwen.
I think I'm good right now. Thank you, Senator Landon.
All right. Appreciate that, Senator. Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I was looking at my list. I'm concerned we really haven't solved the funding for WIDOT. We talked a lot of options, but I'm not sure we're helping them with anything we are doing as legislature to help fund WIDOT. So I think we need to continue to follow up on that, Mr. Chairman. big on the charging station fees. I think we need to do that. Going back to something we talked about, going back to the military, I'm very concerned about the staffing for the Veterans Nursing Facility in Buffalo. We've been told several times they don't have the staff. I'd like to resolve that in June, making sure we've got that covered. As well as if we need to do anything to help the military on the child care issue that was raised, that's an important issue for them for recruiting, because recruiting is becoming a problem for the National Guard. So those are some of my issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, I appreciate those thoughts. We have not suggested that we bring forward any consideration of the fuel tax bill. That is not something that really rose to priority level on the management council. But Mr. Co-Chairman, do we bring it for the next meeting? I'm getting some sentiment that we ought to at least look at it.
Mr. Chairman, I think we can bring it and look at it. I mean, I think we've heard from the users and those groups, they're more positive towards an increase in the fuel tax than they are anything else. And I guess we could bring a bill and beat it up and see what the committee thinks.
I'm inclined to do it. Mr. Chairman, I agree with Senator Furphy. I think if we're doing our jobs, we're at least taking a look at it. And going back to Representative Baker, his indication, you know what, we've got things ahead of us that we've got to continue to look at. Heather?
House Bill 26.
That's House Bill 26. I think that's a start. As you know, the Senate really didn't get to look at that. We have not been exposed to that bill. It was over on the House side. So, I think, again, committee, if we either vote it up or vote it down as a committee bill, but I think that we should be discussing these very important policy issues. So, Heather, if you would please have that one ready.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so go ahead.
And it is a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll mark that up. We'll do all kinds of things with it to get to a final form, but it's a starting place.
I think it's a start. Thank you, Senator Furphy. Senator Anderson?
I'm concerned about that 10-year review on the CDLs. I think Joe addressed that with the, but I can't find those particular statutes. Is that what you were addressing there, Joe?
Representative McGuire is shaking his head, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. That one right there. So I'm concerned about that one since I have a constituent who did all the 10-year review stuff and didn't get his license back yet from the feds. So I'm a little concerned about this and the feds stuffing us down our throat. I'd rather not do anything than comply with them if they're not gonna work with our citizens. And the others have been discussed. There's a lot of important stuff to do. I think we've got to come out with something for the DOT funding. We've got to come out with something. And it sounds like everybody's agreeable to the fuel tax and maybe even the sales tax. So I think it's a good idea that we look at something on the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate that. Senator Pappas?
I was going to bring up the issue about the fuel tax. To me, since we didn't do anything this last year with the RUC, we didn't do anything with I-80 tolling. I just don't want to keep, and we didn't pass the fuel tax this last year. We're just kicking the can down the road for funds for YDOT. So I am in favor of bringing back a tax bill at least at the minimum. And frankly, larger than the bill that was in the legislature this year. But I think we've heard from everybody that they prefer that rather than anything else. And so,
Yeah.
I do want to see that
I think it's an important policy discussion too, Senator, and I think we could certainly take that up at the next meeting. And thank you, Heather, for getting that ready to go. Before we go any further, I'm looking over at Mary Beth, and this is like one of your last days. This is maybe it, isn't it? For us, this is our last day, and we don't want to have you, we don't want you to go. But we are committee members losing Mary Beth to one of our other agencies or another operation in Cheyenne, and we wish you all that is good. Mary Beth, thank you for everything you've done for us. I think we should give you a we are going to miss you, and that permission thing on the right back corner of the Senate chamber, I'm not sure you got the permission yet, but we'll work on that. Heather, I want to come back to you. What did we miss, and did you have anything in your notes that we didn't want to forget or we want to take forward?
Mr. Chairman, I think with adding something in there for funding, that was, I think perhaps the only hole that I had identified. Otherwise, it appears as though the committee has addressed, I believe, all of the different areas that you kind of had inserted placeholders during conversation to return to. There are several asks of others, such as an in-depth briefing of the electric vehicle process that I believe that you asked of Director Reiner, but I know that they're very, very good about catching different questions and things like that. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe that I believe that we've addressed, the committee has addressed, I believe everything that they maybe were wanting to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the college for allowing us to intrude for a while. And I do want to thank PBS. Gentlemen, thank you at the back of the room. You've been a really big help the last 2 days. So thank you for that. And I really appreciate our staff. Again, thank you, ladies. And Mary Beth, Godspeed. Best to you. Amanda and Heather, we'll see you soon. Committee, we're adjourned.